Welcome again to this event on ethics, AI, technology, and society, organized by the AI Ethics Committee from Chalmers Research Center, together with Världskulturmuseet. So my name is Gerardo Schneider. I'm a professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, a shared department between Chalmers and the University of Gothenburg. And I will be chairing this event today, if this allows me to go forward. Yes. So I would like to start with a few words about the Chalmers Artificial Intelligence Research Center that has as a mission to develop unique AI expertise in research, education, and innovation, to offer a highly attractive environment for world-leading AI researchers, and to be a preferred partner for Swedish industry in what concerns artificial intelligence. And as the name indicates, the Chair Ethics Committee, formed by the people you see here, has as main concern to handle the ethical aspect of the use of this theoretical and new technology that is artificial intelligence. So what is this event about? In this half day, we want to address crucial questions about the interaction between us, people, and machines, in particular artificial intelligence. And some of such questions are, for instance, what decisions can be taken by machines, which can be taken by us, people, how we should interact with computers in general, in particular with AI devices. Are there domains that we want to exclude from AI decision taking? And what is the role of work in the long term, the short term, and in general, how AI-dominated society will affect our daily life, in particular our working conditions. For that, we want to take this from a different perspective from, of course, the technical side, computer science and engineering, social sciences, ethics, and philosophy. So to achieve this, we have invited 4 international experts, academics, to discuss these issues. And I will very briefly introduce them. So you're welcome to look into their homepage and the description of the event if you want to know more about each one of them. So Amanda Laverquist, she's a professor at Media and Communication Studies at the Department of Informatics and Media, Uppsala University. As her main research interests are on digital human vulnerabilities in the light of existential philosophy, focusing empirically on death online and on digital memories. She is the principal investigator of the Uppsala Informatics and Media Hub for Digital Existence, and she leads the project BioMe on existential challenges and ethical imperatives of biometric artificial intelligence. She has been a Wallenberg Academy Fellow during the years 2014, 2018, and in such role, she has founded the field of existential media studies. And recently, she has published a book that will appear next year, published by Oxford University Press, on existential media, a media theory of the limit situation. Devda Duvashi, he's a professor in the Data Science and AI Division at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Chalmers. His main research interests are algorithms and machine learning, has led several national projects and participated in many European projects in machine learning, has been also external expert on a report on data-driven innovation for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And he's active in the main conferences in machine learning, for instance, NeurIPS, ICML, and IJCAI. Barbara Planck, she's a professor in the computer science department at the IT University of Copenhagen. Her research focuses on natural language processing, more particularly in aspects related to learning. Barbara has been the general chair of the 22nd Northern Computational Linguistic Conference, NODALDA, and the workshop chair of the ACL, Association for Computational Linguistics, in 2019. She's a member of the advisory board for the European Association for Computational Linguistics and vice president of the Northern European Association for Language Technology. Last but not least, we have Professor Moshe Vardi, George Distinguished Service Professor in Computational Engineering and Director of the Ken Kennedy Institute for Information Technology at Rice University in the United States. His research is in general on automated reasoning and logic, and this is very broadly because Moshe has interest in many aspects of computer science. And he is the author and co-author of more than 650 papers, as well as 2 books. He holds many awards and scientific awards, and is a member of many different societies and honorary academies. He holds 7 honorary doctorates, and in particular, the last one, as far as I know, is the one that was offered here by the University of Gothenburg. It was supposed to happen now, the ceremony. It was delayed for next year. And he's a senior editor of the ACM, one of the main venues for dissemination of computing science research. So these are the 4 presenters, speakers of today. So this is the program. We will start immediately after my presentation with Amanda Laverquist. And as you see here, we will follow the order I presented: Devdat, Tubashi, Barbara Planck, and finally Moshe Vardi, who will be participating virtually. We will make a very short break before Moshe's presentation for technical reason, because it needs to arrange the setting with the camera and everything. So 5 minutes we will do before Moshe's presentation, and after that will be a coffee break. And then after the coffee break, there will be a panel discussion moderated by Professor Ulle Högström from Chalmers. And during this panel discussion will be, of course, opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So with that, I finish the introduction and I let the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation, Gerardo, and the Chair Ethics Committee, and of course also Världskulturmuseet for this fine opportunity to come to this beautiful museum and share some of my thinking and work on the issues of concern here today. I will begin with a provocation. Ethics in the realm of AI, I argue, is like the sought-after right answer that solves the issue and terminates the problem or program, ending the exchange. Ethical solutions are all we need. There's no time for questions without answers. In a world where the future itself has been colonized by AI, ethics is thus formulated in a solutionist mode, packaged as actionable principles and tools for assessing how these should be implemented. Technology is the prime mover. Ethics is the solutionist remedy. Clearly, to counter this, new solutions have emerged that suggest that design itself should be ethical, trustworthy, value-sensitive from the outset. In this situation, why should the humanities bother? I mean, with their passion for ambivalence, ambiguity, paradox, uncertainty, the unmeasurable, the perverted, the hidden, the obscure, with their sensibility for secrets, mysteries, imaginations, and complexities. with their sensitivities about limits, embodiment, mortality, and their endless curiosity about our human and also more than human condition, including their critique of normativity. Clearly, the humanities are off-grid from the very start, anomalies and bugs in the system. Or is that precisely why they should bother? And my answer is they must. For the humanities, raising the right or pertinent questions rather than providing or expecting absolute answers or clear-cut solutions is a core value and virtue. And this is where I find that it's often difficult to agree upon the terms of the debate on these matters, since there is no common recognition of what ethics means at heart. The way the conditions for this debate is set often makes the humanities disqualified from the very beginning, despite the fact that all the great traditions in ethics and philosophy constitute a valuable and essential normative dialogue across the centuries about the good life, with no simple answers and yet with lessons for us all today. Such a dialogue with nuances, respect for otherness, patience in the spirit of what Charles Melvin S. calls ethical pluralism is the imperiled core of a democratic society, but also of an existentially sustainable society. So what are then the right questions to ask in relation to AI and ethics at a point in time when everything is defined as ethics and when everyone and all, industry, academia, the public, civil society, policymakers, are striving to be ethical? In light of the many risks identified for misuse of AI technology and personal data, we have seen an ethical turn. Corporations are often accused of ethical whitewashing or turning issues of politics into a safety zone of ethics that they themselves will solve. There are also calls for policy interventions and, of course, proposed bans. In particular, the use of facial recognition technology for vastly diverse areas, such as improved consumer experiences or efficient surveillance, is under the ethical microscope. The recent implementation of the General Data Protection Regulation provides, first of all, for better protection of individuals' personal data. This and related data protections are rooted primarily in Kantian deontology, namely the insistence on protecting basic rights to privacy, equal treatment before the law, freedom of expression, and so on, and grounded in the insistence on the human being as a rational autonomy. In addition to the GDPR, central EU initiatives and documents frame much contemporary discussion on AI ethics. After reviewing 85 of these initiatives, Aline Shakti-Franske has identified a dominating utilitarian bent, but also what she calls a values monoculture or a values canon shared across these documents. So in addition to this Kantian values of privacy and autonomy, these include transparency, justice, fairness, minimizing bias, non-maleficence, reducing harm to humans, security, safety, responsibility, accountability, trust, sustainability, and dignity. These ongoing initiatives and debates help identify a series of critical risks emerging in AI systems, starting with multiple risks of both privacy and data privacy protection rights. In addition, multiple problems of bias have been highlighted. Franske points out that these values are almost always presented in an ungrounded and superficial way, according to her. So in this situation, what can a humanistic and more specifically existential approach add to the picture? One key question that I think is fundamental to both begin with and then to linger on can be found in the commonly held idea expressed by the EU in their list of principles for ethically aligned AI. That is, all AI produced in Europe should be human-centered. But who is in fact who is in fact the human behind the expression human-centered? What are those most valued human assets worthy of protection? What is implied by autonomy and privacy if we move beyond the liberal subject? In addition, it's important to ask what values do we need to defend if we define humans existentially. Shoshana Zuboff, for example, searches for an existential language in order to safeguard the future tense as an elemental human right to, quote, imagine, intend, promise, and construct a future, end of quote, which has been hijacked by surveillance capitalists' eternal quest for ever more effective tools of prediction. By mining the intimate depth of our everyday lives for raw material, which is then fed back to us by automated protocols intended to modify our behavior, surveillance capitalism, according to Zuboff, is challenging, quote, the inner resources from which we draw the will to will, end of quote. By consequence, and with a more elaborate existentialist agenda, I stress that the present moment is in fact a digital limit situation in which there are massive ethical and political stakes for networked humans. So on the road to existentializing media, I propose in my forthcoming book that we revisit what it means to be human in the present age of techno-cultural saturation by attending to how existential media both ground us in being and sort of throws us up into the air, implying heightened uncertainties and risks, while speaking to our shared vulnerability and relationality, demanding ethical response. My ethics, with inspiration from the online mourners I was privileged to follow over many years and interview, places emphasis on virtues and values of slowness, waiting, silence, roundness, disconnection, and thus of limits. As for post-humanist philosophy, as some of you may be familiar with, its insights are only the beginning, not the end point of the discussion. Positing machines as acting as ethical agents, situating ethics transversally across human and more than human domains, that is, in things, technologies, and human subjects. Ethical responsibility is here seen as distributed across various forms of agency. My point is that these assemblages simultaneously produce new forms of lived experience that bring humans and their bodies back into the loop in ways that should evoke a renewed interest in classic existential concerns. Hence, formulating an ethics for the present day and age of increased automation and entanglements of human with other realms requires that we begin by revisiting basic existential questions about what it means to be human, mortal, and especially embodied. My research team, BioMe, that Gerardo mentioned, has produced a manifesto for an existential ethics of care in living with automation. And I will share the contours of this manifesto today, but it can also be shared with you in due course. Chiseled out in relation to several ethical projects, such as existential philosophy, feminist ethics, and virtue ethics. So we aim to create a new conversation in an era in urgent need of a plurality of perspectives on our technological development. An existential ethics of care starts from and never leaves the vulnerable and mortal body. What we coin the existential body of finite and fragile uniqueness, while also stressing both human responsibility and accountability. Hence, we argue that the ethical challenges raised by these technologies ultimately testify to the fact that even in the age of ever-present machines, as critical data studies scholar Bitai Ashana argues, ethics is bodies. Thus, the focus is on the human life world and how an existential ethics of care provides a way of thinking about the challenges of living with automation, with a particular focus on human embodiment. This is in line with what Ashana also stresses, and she says that she approaches the ethical implications of biometric artificial intelligence through the prism of precisely embodiment and singularity, understood as, and I quote Ashana, concepts that challenge both the traditional framework of bioethics, with its prescribed cluster of codes, regulations, principles, and protocols, and the libertarian approach, with its taken for granted values of liberty, privacy, and autonomy. So aligning here with Ashana's agenda, we also recognize that it promises to challenge some of these taken for granted values in the guidelines of late. So to briefly sum up the philosophical roots of our manifesto, an existential ethics of care should begin with inward insight and singular responsibility, as in Søren Kierkegaard, but should not be limited to the personal sphere, but necessarily applies outwards to others who are embodied coexisters, as in Jasper's, Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, in our globally and ecologically interlinked world. While recognizing the innate vulnerability of all beings, we further draw on feminist ethics of care, which insists that vulnerability must be traced and understood in plurality, and that material actualities of lives lived under oppression are essential to ethical considerations. The fact that ethics is bodies also means that an existential ethics of care needs to take the sensory and the imaginary seriously as a starting point, rather than as something we add toward the end, and must also take into account the more than human webs of care. This realization is combined with embracing certain values pertaining to well-being and human flourishing and of living well together as key in a virtue ethics for a technological era, attending also to the inherent threats to such values. This is of particular concern in the realm of biometrics. Biometrics is technology built to measure life, more specifically the digital representations of our unique physiological data and behavior, such as facial patterns, eye retinas, gait, palm geometry, and fingerprints, for the purposes of, for example, efficient identification and authentication. Now, consider 3 sites where biometric is now implemented within everyday life, raising crucial ethical questions that all center on tensions between the existential body and the biometric body. At the border, actually I'm going to take some water, so you have to just reflect on that first. At the border, our personal biometric data is increasingly treated as assets for authentication and verification of our true selves, and police and judiciary systems are developing both face and voice recognition and analysis in preemptive policing and immigration control. Here, the existential body is challenged by the reductionist body, which, through biometric passports and contactless border controls, enables some individuals to project themselves in space and time, others to be deemed as risk subjects without movement. And this form of objectification and reduction also implies that it implies a severing of both the individual from the singular person and of the existential body from her relational being. As Ashana has concluded, paradoxically, in its pursuit of capturing the singularity of the person, biometrics only ends up by obstructing the exposure of singularity precisely because of its amputation of narrative from the sphere of identity. In fact, an equally problematic reduction and sequestration also occurs as officers at the border are bound to the machine and have to downplay their own judgment and deafen themselves to any narratives that the traveler wishes to communicate. the bedroom, smart household appliances, so-called digital assistants such as Amazon's Alexa, Google Assistant and Apple Siri do more than passively follow their users' voice commands. Through new forms of domestic surveillance, corporations record our words and interpret our sounds, often for unspecified purposes. But what is at stake for humans here is also that the existential body is threatened by the prospects of the ideology of transparency, or of the transparent body, which is a biometrically forged body without secrets and whose existential needs for secrecy, perversion, alterity, queerness, but also for sleep and rest are invaded by the surveillance technologies of smart home assistants. Finally, in the biohacker, we find a breached body where bodily integrity itself is called into question by these self-invasive practices of chipping as perceived resistance, or of self-tracking and self-quantification connected to, of course, big datafication and at the mercy of the big tech players. Experientially, the self is professedly here in control, while often paradoxically positioned against a culture of normativity and against ideals of autonomous subjectivity. The ethical risk is, of course, that this becomes a new normal. Consider you have your personal identification number, but maybe this becomes a new norm, so we will all be shipped. Consider that. So the existential body in both irreducibility, secrecy, and within limits is here challenged through these externalized self in becoming, which is always reaffirmed through numbers, quantifications. So, in sum, the biometric body is not only pure information, of course. The biometrics is felt in the body, as the body itself is implicated by technological intervention. What is at stake existentially in these biometrically informed life worlds is, we argue in this manifesto, an all-pervasive form of reinforced objectification of the existential body that reduces, forges compulsory transparency vis-à-vis and breaches the body in different and ethically, perhaps problematic ways. So in light of this, how do we safeguard the human defined as the existential body within and in relation to biometric technology? Via algorithms, the biometrical data of the body anchors a person's identity. But in a stroke, body and identity are separated in case of a failure or shortcoming of the technology. In other words, who are you when the connection to the biometric databases fails? As the databases and systems increasingly transcend state and national borders, the accountability of data is weakened and dispersed, while its recognized flaws and biases that often target marginalized groups continue to reinforce bias of race and gender, for instance. So what institution can validate identity when the body itself fails to do so, due to the fact that the machine has failed? What happens to the self when the biometric data is the proxy of a person's identity, nationality, history, narrative, and truth? The individual is thrown into the role as mediator, but becomes itself the point of separation. As previously stated, the unique historical person, the existential body, always in becoming, is now at risk of being redacted into these snapshots of personhood based on not only fixed datafications of the individual itself, but of course also on the fixed datafication of thousands of others equally reduced. This nailing of bodies to identities within the ideology of transparency produces paradoxically a void of embodied existence, hollowing out perhaps what it means to be human. So in this talk, I have mapped the existential stakes and ethical concerns that biometrics raises within our contemporary life worlds. But is this picture too bleak? Defenders will argue that even if biometric AI exploits, surveils, reduces, and objectifies humans, they are also productive, as they bring into being new forms of knowledge, social relations, new assemblages and webs of everyday life flow, new data subjectivities, new forms of being human, new forms of embodiment. And while all of this is certainly true, at the same time, these phenomena call for an existential ethics, and I believe beyond this so-called ethical turn, simply because they shape and mold what it means to exist. An existential ethics of care includes modes of questioning, raising perhaps the right questions, rewiring and opening up ethical assumptions rather than providing fixed tools or frameworks for solving ethical dilemmas. As has been clear in my presentation, our existential ethics of care is not a solutionist list of principles or suggestions, but a manifesto for a way of thinking about the ethical challenges of living with biometrics in today's world. While we necessarily appreciate the importance and the need for pragmatic and hands-on policy interventions, we also recognize the urgency within AI ethics to return to the existential grounds upon which all ethical considerations are built. In fact, a widely spanning ethical approach can draw on insights on a smaller scale, emanating from particular sites within our life worlds, where our lives are played out. So an existential ethics of care implies, in the first instance, a conscious move back to more fundamental questions of existential nature. Such existentially informed questions, regardless of whether they are answered or remain intentionally open, should become a basis for a diversified ethical approach, heeding a plurality of ethical views. Is one prerequisite for arriving at responsible AI or technology at large. Hence, beyond the current ethical turn, an existential ethics of care draws on multiple ethical traditions, and these encounters may both be beneficiary and entail some friction, but foremost, they bring forward the human and her complex relations to identity and body. However, frictions and difference in views can also be productive. Again, our intention is not to lean toward reconciliation of those views. Rather, by foregrounding the existential dimensions of our inseparably entangled human coexistence with technologies, we hope to create a more solid ground for exploring how those views can productively speak to each other. One key value of this proposed existential ethics of care is its insistence on productive and careful collisions as a virtue in itself. Our manifesto also hopes to broaden the existential purview. If historically, ethical considerations used to pertain to the human condition alone, with a priority given to the condition of a white Western European man, today they need to encompass agencies and realms that stretch far beyond that perspective. Diverse forms of coexistence that we individuals and societies compose with technologies are becoming ever more integrated into multiple other realms out there, so to speak, of both human and more than human nature. Similarly, our current forms of engagements with technologies will have a ripple effect in the future. What it means is that we urgently need to recalibrate our ethical incentives and sensitivities so they encompass perspectives on certain unacknowledged pasts and also uncertain futures. Finally, our manifesto is written to be communicated. It's not simply for us. Hence, we hope that a focus on these existential dimensions and ethical concerns within human lived experience might be beneficial for not just one type of audience or one kind of expertise. Our intention instead is to inform relations that emerge in and through transdisciplinary collaboration on responsible and meaningful technologies together with AI researchers. We hope to have provided an agenda that illustrates the virtues of the existential approach to ethics and technology, mobilized in conversation with other traditions, which may in turn serve as the foundation on which comprehensive frameworks can be built to address the complexities and prospects for ethical machines, responsible biometrics, and AI. Thank you.
We have time for, while Devdat, please, time for one or two quick questions from the audience. If you want to ask a specific question now, otherwise, of course, there will be time for discussions and questions later. Any specific question now to Amanda? Just one quick question from me. In a slide, when you mention existentialism and a feminist approach to ethics, in which sense is a difference, or why feminists and not in general?
Why not?
In general, what is specific of...
Well, our approach has tried to integrate feminist ethics of care, a virtue ethics approach, and insights from the classic existentialists on ethics. So it's a hybrid, I would say. And I think all have something to contribute to the other debates, and I think this is only the beginning for us to try to formulate our ethics as a group. So it has been very exciting and productive to work on a manifesto as a research team.
Thank you. No question, then thanks again.
Thank you.
We will come with more questions later. Thank you. Next talk by Devdat Duvashi, please.
So thanks again for the invitation, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this event. I think there should be more such events, and hopefully this is just the start. So Boston Review issue on May 20, 2021 featured a forum discussion, which is exactly the topic of today's workshop, Ethics, Technology, Society. And it was the lead article there was by Daron Acemoglu, who is a well-known and very prominent economist at MIT. So he's economist based at MIT, and there were responses from a number of other people, some of those that we will discuss later in the talk. And the title of his presentation was AI's Future Doesn't Have to Be Dystopian. And of course, as he says, he starts off by saying, we all know that AI can be used to increase human productivity, create jobs, shared prosperity, etc. But he also issued some warnings. And as an economist, he was particularly focusing on the implications of AI and AI technology and AI and automation on the future of jobs. And his main focus was that the kind of technology and progress that we are seeing in AI today is characterized by a heavy focus on automating work, or automating to an excessive degree, and not really focusing on investing in human productivity on the other hand. And he says that this may undermine democracy and individual freedoms. He has an extensive discussion on that, but the focus of my presentation today is really on the first part, which is what are the implications of AI and AI technology on the future of jobs. Maybe we can get into a discussion on implications for democracy later on in the discussion.
I'm sorry, you have to stand a little bit more closer to get in the camera. Otherwise, you're outside.
Okay, but I can't see otherwise. Can I stand here?
That's perfect. Thank you.
All right. So now this topic has been discussed for quite a while now. There have been a number of books written on this topic. So Martin Ford has a book called Rise of the Robots. Carl Benedict Frey, who was a researcher at Oxford, had a study on implications of AI technology for jobs. He came out with a book a few years back called The Technology Trap, and even more recently, Daniel Susskind, who's also based at Oxford, came out with a book on what does it mean, or what are the implications of a future for a world without work. And another very popular book recently that's been in the popular pop charts, Yuval Noah Harari, he described this as the greatest problem, maybe a little facetious, but greatest problem of the 21st century economics is what to do with surplus humans. On the other hand, there's an opposite group of people who believe that all this is very overblown, and they say there will always be new jobs because, I mean, this has always been true in different phases in history. There have been technological developments. We know that this happened several times. I mean, there were societies which were agricultural, and then new technology came up and displaced all the work on agricultural fields. But then, there were new jobs found in industry, and the people working in those agricultural jobs then were displaced, but they moved over to new jobs in industry. So this is a recurring theme that's been happening all throughout history, and there have been these movements against technology, which by the so-called Luddites, but their fears were misplaced because new jobs were created by new technologies, and so on and so forth. So they said this is just a recurring phenomenon. This is the same story being played out once again. There's nothing new this time. And a short summary of their position would be that everything is for the best, and science, technology, and market, just leave it to science, technology, and market. They will solve this problem out as usual. So the first quote is by Dr. Pangloss from Voltaire, who had this kind of philosophy, and perhaps the best-known exponent of this philosophy today in many popular books is Steven Pinker, who came out recently with a book called Enlightenment Now, talking essentially had the same theme repeated with several examples. And more recently has come out with another book called Rationality, where he pursues the same thing over and over again. So now, which of these two positions is true? Well, we don't know. We have to see, but I don't think that it is really this kind of position, just to be sanguine without further, closer examination is really not sustainable. So let's look at what the technology says about this. We have two perspectives from two very well-known and very famous AI technology people. The first one is Andrew Ning, who is a professor at Stanford. He was one of the people who founded Google Brain. He was also a chief scientist at Baidu, the Chinese version of Google. And many of you might know him also as the founder and ex-CEO of Coursera, which is these massive online open courses from which many people from around the world have learned about AI. And he has a very nice one-para summary of what is the current state of AI technology. That if there is something that a typical person can do with a mental task which takes less than a second or so of thought, then this is something which we can automate using AI technologies today. And this is a pretty fair summary of progress that's been made in, for example, this was mentioned in Amanda's talk. Also, you can take images and you can classify things in images. You can detect objects in images. So that kind of technology is pretty well developed today. You may have heard that it has achieved superhuman performance in recognizing objects in pictures. Another one that maybe we'll hear more about from Barbara, who is an expert in that area, is in natural language processing. So there again, we've witnessed some very impressive developments and impressive advances in the technology of how to take natural language technology and say automatically pass from English to France, vice versa. So you can do, maybe a lot of us already use it on a day-to-day basis when we use Google Translate. Targeted online ads, we all know we keep getting hit by this on Facebook or wherever. They seem to be very uncannily good at targeting ads to people. So these kinds of things are certainly possible using the technology today. This is the kind of things that today's technology can do. And the same message is conveyed by another technology person, Kai-Fu Lee, who used to be one of the leading technologies in AI's, in Apple's AI technology team. Now he's a tech and AI entrepreneur in China, and he's written two very nice, interesting books. The first one talks about is mainly focuses on the AI war between AI and China, between US and China, who's going to win this stakes for supremacy in AI. And those are the AI superpowers. But in that book, and in a more recent book talking about where AI is going in the near future in 2041, he also examines this question: what is the implications of AI and AI technologies for jobs? And his conclusion is very similar to Andrew Ning, but he has a very nice pictorial way of depicting it. So here is. When AI displaces jobs, you can think about it in the physical labor, physical jobs, or cognitive labor, jobs that require thinking. And here's a classification. So one axis is social versus asocial, things which require social contact with humans and others which less so. So that's one axis. And here on the other axis, with physical labor, the axis goes from things which require high dexterity in an unstructured environment to low dexterity in a structured environment. And the danger zone for AI displacement is here, when you have asocial tasks in low dexterity and structured environments. So a teller or cashier, a truck driver, assembly line inspector, these jobs are very much in danger of being automated away. The current technology or near future technology can automate these jobs. On the other hand, jobs that are somewhat safe, elderly home caretaker, hairstylist, these are jobs that are more social and they work in unstructured environments. Those are relatively immune to automation, at least for now. If you go to the cognitive jobs, again, you have the social versus asocial axis, and then you have another axis which is something that requires more creativity or something you can just brute force optimize. And here again, the danger zone is in this region where you have asocial jobs which don't require too much of creativity. So you have heard that radiologists, by looking at images and detecting whether there's cancer in the tissue, or a customer service representative, basic translation, telemarketer, these jobs are, again, very much in danger of being automated away. These kinds of jobs can disappear very quickly. On the other hand, things which are somewhat safe for the time being, a psychiatrist, a social worker, a criminal defense attorney, and unfortunately also CEOs, they are not, you can't automate them away right away. So the bottom line, the message from here is that it's a little bit naive and not, so to just have this sanguine attitude that things will be, this is just another nothing new. This time is not different from previous times. I think that kind of thing is a little bit dangerous and naive to think that. One should devote some more thought to this issue and what implications this might have for society, because 40 to 50% displacement of jobs, replacement jobs, is a very major disruption in society if it actually comes to pass. So in this book, it alternates between descriptions of current technology as well as science fiction stories that take their inspiration from that. And in one of those things, he paints a picture of what happens when all jobs are automated away and there are no jobs to do for humans. So it turns out that AI has to invent some jobs for humans to pretend that they're working. So to address what might happen with all of this, Acemoglu and Restrepo, who again, it's the same economics team at MIT, and they describe the current technology trends as focusing on the wrong kind of AI. And by that they mean that this is a kind of AI that does too much excessive automation. I mean, some automation may be good if you want to get rid of boring jobs, repetitive jobs, that may be good, but other ways of trying to automate jobs are not so good. And so the business model that drives this kind of thing is something that's driven by generating benefits for a very narrow fraction of society that's already rich and politically powerful. So it's very connected up with the structure of society, economic and power structures in society, and it's enhancing those features. So large tech companies which have been driving a lot of this automation, they're focused on automation and removing the fallible human element in the production process. That's been their drive. And this particular thing has actually come out in very strong, sharp focus recently. We've gone through these 2 years of COVID, and we saw that very dramatically there, that when you have something where humans are fallible, they fall sick. They fall sick very badly in COVID times. They transmit the sickness to other people when they interact. And so it would be from a company point of view, from a just the bottom line, profit bottom line point of view, it would be obviously very attractive for them to just get rid of all the contact between humans. And in fact, there has been, so this is an issue that probably people will study over the next few years, and we will see the results coming out. But there have been initial indications that COVID-19 induced a large surge in automation from companies. They invested a lot in increasing the automation in their services. And there have been some predictions that these kinds of contactless solutions will probably extend well beyond COVID-19 and go into the longer, will remain in the longer term. And just one example here is a robot delivery service in a British area called Milton Keynes. It increased its the number of customers by 100% in these COVID times using these contactless delivery solutions. So this is the kind of thing that we are looking at now. Whether this is really true, again, we will find out in the immediate future. But there has been a move in this direction. And this is another recent book that came out which touches on some of the themes that also came up in Amanda's talk by Kate Crawford. And so she looks at this question not just in terms of automation, but even in terms of what has been the effect of AI and these automation technologies on jobs, even if they're not automated away. And the kind of things that she's exploring there, at least so she touches on many different topics and many other things that you may or may not agree with her. I certainly don't agree with everything she says in the book. But she has one chapter examining the effects on labor and on these kinds of effects, and which are effects which are not just automation, but other broader impact of AI technologies. For example, she talks about what happens with mass surveillance. What happens with, mass surveillance is in Amazon warehouses, for example, the workers are constantly surveyed all the time to see how well they're doing on the job. And then there is algorithmic assessment. And this is the famous, Amazon has so-called rate of how efficiently workers are are they keeping up with their targets. They're constantly monitored by cameras and other AI technologies to see whether they are keeping up with the rate. It's a constant monitoring on time. And so they even have, so Amazon has something called the time clock. Google has true time. So these have become measures of efficiency that are maintained very strictly. And so the effect of doing all of this is that you create a large pool of poorly paid, easily replaced, part-time contract workers at the bottom, and a group of highly paid workers at the top who design the software doing all of this stuff. So this is the effect of, even if you don't replace jobs, what is happening to the kind of jobs that currently exist, especially in these large tech companies. And this kind of description, it starts resembling more and more closely. It's not so far away from what is in Elysium. If some of you have seen this movie, the science fiction movie with Matt Damon, so in Elysium you have a very ravaged and poor Earth, which is completely polluted and ravaged, and very poor people live on Earth, and the rich people have all migrated to Elysium, which is something that orbits around the Earth. It's a station where you live a very high quality life with very advanced medical services. But there are some people who are privileged to live in Elysium, and the rest of the human populace is damned to live on this ravaged Earth that is left behind. And so this kind of description is not quite there yet, but it's dangerously going in that direction. And if you listen to some things that Jeff Bezos says sometimes, that it really starts sounding like he wants to have lots of Elysiums orbiting everywhere in the solar system. So even if the robots don't take your jobs, they are certainly making it worse in various ways. So what should we do if we want to address these issues? If we don't want to go to the Elysium future, and hopefully none of us wants to go there, how do we go about redirecting AI for social good? And these are suggestions from this article by Acemoglu, which led the discussion in the Boston Review article, the forum that I just showed you at the start. So first of all, he says that there must be, it's very important to have government regulation and leadership. That's one of the very important things. And that the market alone cannot do this. And he has a very long discussion about this. So there has to be a massive redirection of technological change, especially in AI. And again, just to push this point about why the market cannot be left to do it by itself. And as I said, he has many reasons to do that. But one simple thing that one can, appreciate is that these companies, their profit motives and business models, their incentives, they are aligned in a very different direction. For them, these incentives, they go towards automation, monitoring. That's what gives them the bottom line profit. So if you leave it to them, you're not going to get any change in this direction. And then he says, I think a very part of this massive redirection of technological change is also a massive change in societal norms. So there has to be much more transparency, democratic discourse, and accountability. These are very key things that need to be put in place in order to put a check on these trends that we've been discussing. And then he says, this is directed to people like us or like me, that AI researchers should themselves become more sensitive and vocal about the social consequences of their actions. This is a bit similar to, when nuclear weapons were developed and so on. You said, scientists should be more vocal and concerned about the effects of their research. In particular, in that Acemoglu and Restrepo article, that they also talk about the special role of universities, which is again something I highlighted because it's addressed to people like me, is that since a lot of these companies are investing in these kinds of technologies and they have these incentives that drive them to do it, it puts a lot of pressure on universities because this kind of thing, the best minds in our best students, our cleverest students, they start gravitating towards the kind of computer science, AI that these big tech companies are doing. That's the cool thing to do, so they want to do it as well. So these students start gravitating towards this kind of AI and machine learning with a heavy emphasis on automation. And then we are in the same loop. We will kind of be the slave drivers that create these students for them to exploit in their technology. So there is a special role for universities in challenging this trend as well. So to check this excessive drive to automation, universities have a very important role to play as well, according to them, and I agree with them. So if you're able to do this, if these are the things that will help us in trying to check this drive to excessive automation and preventing the Elysium picture, rather go towards Christiania. So I don't know what message all of you got from having Christiania in the title of my talk, so I don't want to take anything else about Christiania except what I meant there was to take their founding motto. So this is the mission statement of Christiania, to create a self-governing society where each and every individual holds themselves responsible for the well-being of the whole entire community. So that's all I want to take from Christiania. All the other things we know about Christiania, not necessarily. And if you're able to do that, then we can move towards AI for social good in the vision of two visions that I think we can look up to. So this was in 1930, John Maynard Keynes talking about technology and the progress of technology and progress of economics, is that he thought we would soon arrive at an era where we are free from the pressing economic cares, and we would have a lot more leisure. So when we are freed from economic cares and we have this freedom, then we would be able to live wisely, agreeably, and well. This was something that Amanda alluded to in her talk as well. What is the wise life, the good life? That's what John Maynard Keynes was talking about in 1930. Somehow it didn't quite move in that direction at all, went almost in the opposite direction, but maybe we can revive that vision. And a more recent version of that has been asserted or described in this recent book by Martin Hägglund called This Life. And so it has two different things. So the first part has to do with religion and spirituality and so on, and the second part has to do more with the kind of economics and society we want today. So if we want to live a free life, then for him that means we must also own the question of what we do with our time. And if you want to reach freedom in this sense, AI can be the tool that enables you to do that, because AI is exactly something that can liberate you from these pressing economic cares, from the drudgery of repetitive tasks and so on, and give you this freedom. But the point is, to achieve AI doing this, we need more than just to let it run by itself, because if it's run by itself, we are moving towards Elysium. If we want to reach this vision of Christiania, then we have to do something which drives it in a different direction towards this. So thanks very much.
Just any questions to Devda, please? Okay, I have a question. You didn't mention at all basic income here, but of course you were going towards Christiania. What happened with the kind of jobs that nobody wants to do? And maybe some of the jobs are the ones that are in the wrong corner of your diagram. How can we achieve the good life with AI helping us, and at the same time that the jobs that needs to be done can be done?
Right. So, well, that's a very deep question. I think there's a statement by Marx. He said, "I would like to fish in the morning, buy a bake of bread in the afternoon, and go out, shopping in the evening, and so on." So, I don't recall that line very perfectly, but essentially that captured what, again, life should be in Christianity, which is you share all these jobs to some extent, and you have to share a little bit of job. A job that you might not really like to do if you had the choice. I mean, part of building each individual being responsible for the community means that there's a certain shared sentiment in the community. So you have to, share together some tasks that have to be done, say, like cleaning the road. Maybe not everybody wants to do that, but if everybody agrees in the larger benefit of the community, you will share the task of cleaning the road. So that's that's the vision there. Now you may or may not agree with it. We can have another discussion. So the other thing about universal basic income, yes, that's another very important suggestion that has come from many different sources, and I think in Martin Hägglund's book also he discusses this, and there is again pros and cons. So on the one hand, the pros is that yes, it is liberating. I mean, if you generate the economic bonanza from AI and so on, you can use it to supply basic income, and then people who are maybe displaced from a certain job, they could use that basic income to read and train and do something else and find a different way to do it. Which, you can live a fulfilling life based on the basic income maybe. There are other people who say that if you do that and people have no work to do, then it loses meaning. You need to have work to do. So again, there is a debate. I don't know which side one should be on, but I mean, I think that there are some things to say in favor of basic income. I think one doesn't necessarily have to think that if you don't have a job to do, then all life loses meaning. I don't see why that should be the case. There are other people who say, how should basic income be financed? I don't think that's a very valid argument either. You never ask the question when you're building new weapon systems or attacking some other country. You don't say, where's the money for that? But if you say basic income, they say, well, where is the money going to come from? So I think those are bogus arguments. So whether basic income removes all meaning for life, that's a deeper question. We can discuss that later.
We have one more question here.
Hi there. Maybe a little bit related, but when we're talking about these different jobs that we will be automating, usually you talk about kind of the mundane and repetitive tasks, and sometimes it sounds like we're doing these people a service because now you can do something more fulfilling and better jobs. But in discussions, a lot of people say, I'm very happy with cleaning the road or something. I can go there and just think my own thoughts. The job is not what I'm burning for. When talking about this discussion about automating jobs, what's your view on that? That we're actually removing. I know we are creating new jobs, but there are a lot of people that are happy with the jobs they have, even if they are, from other point of view, it could be boring, mundane, and repetitive. But some people actually like those kind of jobs. How do you see that?
Right. So yeah. I think it's a good question, and that's why actually that's the whole the theme of the talk was that when you just focus on excessive automation to get rid of all kinds, you don't ask these kinds of questions. I mean, why do you need to automate away these jobs? If people are happy doing it, it gives them fulfillment. Why do you need to automate that away? The bigger question should always be what is good for the good life, for the good society. That's much more important, right, than having the bottom line of the few large companies and the profits they make by automating jobs away. I think that's the focus of discussion has to shift from this constant talk about efficiency and making things faster, better, and so on, to what is a good society? What is a good life? That is the fundamental question.
Thank you.
Thanks, the speaker again. So next talk by Barbara Planck.
Just this. No? No? Do you hear me now? Yeah, now, right? It works. Thank you. So first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to be here, the committee and Geraldo and everyone. And it's really my pleasure to, give this talk after hearing so many great ideas already being raised, points raised by Amanda and by Devtat. And I'm very, very many points ring here also speak to me. And I would like to bring you a little bit more closer to something that Devtat has already mentioned, to this field of, natural language processing. And he even mentioned it nicely in saying, hey, probably all of you using Google Translate in one way or another, right? And this is a wonderful intro because I will dive a little bit into this area, which is my research field, and give you a bit of a perspective, hopefully in the end, that, while it has really increased dramatically and, developed really, really, really crazily fast, which we will see, there is still a lot to be done. And so let's go through it together. So we'll just, to set the scene, NLP is a research field, and the central study object is language, right? And now this is human language, not programming languages, but not formal languages, but human language. And in a sense, we are concerned with dealing with developing technology that tries to, produce and understand language just as we humans do, in a very broad sense. Now, that's very challenging, right? And even the question was raised, who is the human, and what language? And there's all these philosophical questions behind it, but essentially we are in that field that drives a lot of this technology that many of you use. But you know, there's a lot of things happened, and these great systems have been developed to an extent that they have also been released, right, deployed to the public. And that's what raises a lot of even, you know, problems even, you know. How many of you know perhaps this chatbot that was released? How many? Oh, actually quite a few. So this was a chatbot released by Microsoft, and it was actually been taken down after a day because it turned into a racist, racist machine. So this is just one of the examples where, you know, some biases happen, and but this is on the generation side. There is lots of other sources of bias, and that's what I want to show you today here as well. Many of you might have one of these digital assistants we also heard before, but what happened to those? If you take a closer look, then actually, you know, if you look at carefully which languages they actually support nowadays, it's very few, right? It's actually around 10 for the big player, Alexa, today. And here's a nice example from this guy, you know, he's Scottish. He tests this technology. So you might imagine what this video, then how this turns out, right? All right. So this is something, you know, this accent is really then hampering the understanding of the language. And this is just one of the many varieties of English even, which is said to be the most, you know, best, you know, the best language out there for NLP perspective, because we do a lot of English NLP today. But here's another example from machine translation, actually. Okay, this is from the area where I'm from, actually. It's a bilingual area, and you know, one of my key messages is here, while machine translation might be so good, maybe it's actually, you know, you should be careful to not just rely completely on it, blindly. Because if you read this carefully, what happens here? If you read German, then maybe you see that actually this restaurant is serving locals. So it can go wrong. Or here's another example from Spain, where it was about sampling COVID. Okay, so a lot of things can go wrong, even in systems that work well. But if you think about these biases or problems that emerge, one crucial aspect is to be aware that these biases can happen in so many places. They can happen, you know, by when designing the overall system or experiment, but they can creep in so many places. For instance, typically, this is kind of the typical pipeline, right? We are interested in creating an algorithm or a predictive model, and we need some data typically to train the system on. Then we ask humans to give us the labels, but then, you know, humans have different perspectives. And typically, we just take the mode of this, the average perspective, and to train on that. And that's kind of the ground truth we are relying on. So that's one bias. Then how the training data was sampled as well is another bias, right? What is it? Is it like newswire data written by, you know, white men of a certain age, for instance? Or what is the model that we are actually using? Is it a, you know, a neural network, and so on and so forth? So these sources of bias can creep in really all aspects of modeling. It's not just the data, it's not just the algorithm, it's the whole process, and we need to really be aware of, you know, or make also our students aware of how we deal with this technology and how we develop it. So there are some, you know, some recent papers also on the ethical dimension of NLP research, and some, you know, tools, I would call them, to kind of start counteracting, but at least raise awareness, so that you document also what are the kind of data that you create, what is in them, what is covered, and so on and so forth. So first steps are there, but this is a huge, you know, that I think we need to do together to kind of move this field forward responsibly. So in my view, a lot remains to be done to create, in fact, inclusive and robust NLP. And please be aware that this, of course, this is my personal perspective. A lot of personal opinion comes here into this. But at the same time, I want to show you not only these examples, but also a little bit of the historical perspective of the field, to give you an understanding of, hey, how did we get there in the first place? So, in a nutshell, if I had to summarize our field, you know, we are a subfield of AI, and we also started from symbolic approaches, right? Rules governed our field, grammars were written, But then the big leap was essentially to go to the statistical approaches and work from learning from data, annotate data, induce the algorithms, find patterns. And then this is essentially when I also started working in the area, there was this big jump. And this big jump now was deep learning. Neural nets entered the field. And you could say now, if you look at this historical picture from like a bit of the ethics and societal perspective, right, which are interested here today, then here it was more like, okay, the rules are still more interpretable, right? And then these systems here were working actually so-so, right? Thinking of language models, for instance. They were doing quite well, actually. Language models is nothing new. But they weren't as good as they are today. And then this is kind of a little bit of a mechanistic view of this, right? It wasn't so bad, it wasn't working that well, it could solve some issues, but now it was much more interpretable. Then this big step here, in a way, brought us new technology, better representation, self-supervised learning. And what that brought also is, models that, now they work very well, but we can't really control them properly, and we are working on trying to make them to control them. And similarly, we also need to think about the data that feeds in and everything as well. So this was kind of this shift that happened with neural nets, representation learning, where you essentially go to applying these technologies to solve our tasks. But you might know, a lot of you probably heard about BERT, transformers, Elmo, right? So what happened then is, while this is sort of the tsunami of deep learning, and now it's almost, just talked to a colleague here who is teaching NLP, what do you teach nowadays, right? How much deep learning do you teach? How much traditional algorithms? So this is really a choice, or a difficult question, actually, because it's all about deep learning, but there is so much more than that even in the field. It's not just deep learning, okay? But that brings a lot of advances, and one big other leap is, in fact, these contextualized representations, or big pre-trained language models. So what happened is we essentially got to know neural nets better, learned representations, but now the key thing was, okay, you can learn representations which are much more powerful, because in a nutshell, you could distinguish, if you have a person who ducks or ducks out, what does this mean? Is this a verb? Is this a noun? Right? If you read it, it might be not so clear at first. While we had, for instance, just a single representation, now we have actually contextualized representations, which are distinguishing different contexts, and this way are also getting much more powerful. And they are learned from huge text corpora. Okay, this has brought really, huge leaps. We can see now the technology applied out there. So if I summarize the history in a little bit of a different view, you see here, okay, we had the symbolic statistical, rise. The climax, I would say, was deep learning. This was also called the tsunami of deep learning hit the field. And then we got these big language models, right? They can generate data which we believe has almost, was human written often. There's hard to distinguish. But what happens next? What's the next step here, right? Where are we now? Okay, and that's interesting. I think it's a very interesting time right now to be here, where I'm, and to give you a little bit more on where the field is as such. So this was, in fact, deep learning time. You see what happened to the number of submissions to our main conferences. It skyrocketed suddenly, doubled in 2 years' time from 2020, from 1818 to 2020. But at the same time, not just the field grew so quickly, as other fields did, like machine learning in general, also heavily, like we heard already from DEFTA, there is this industry, right, interest, and like just the market value is so huge and increasing as we speak. But this is also this, again, back to the society and ethical aspect, this impact is much more immediate, right? Whatever you do now might be already deployed in a month from now, for instance, right? So it's important to think about what you're doing now and what consequences this might have. And so here's exactly a plot about, just language models. And each of them is like the beginning models and how many parameters these had. and they were rising. Just the sheer size of parameters they have has been growing extremely. Which brings challenges, right? But also benefits. So GDP3 was released, and you can now suddenly, you don't no longer need to train the model for a certain aspect. It has it already, in the model, and you can just prompt it, and in that sense get quite some accuracies out from the plain pre-trained model. But where does it lead us? So I was actually very happy to hear when I heard that Defta's talk is about jobs, that I had one connection to his talk here as well. There is a paper that came out recently by Stanford, which calls now these language models, or these architectures in general, as foundational models. Okay, and foundational models because you can spit in more than just text. And but there was one part about economics, and that was Eric Bragnolso. They did a study on, in fact, how many occupations in the US use writing in some form or another. And they were looking at the skills of jobs out there. And they found that, in fact, for 13% of the occupations, writing was actually one of the primary tasks. Okay? Which means, you could use these language models really, but now the question is how, right? How do you use them? Do you use them to replace the person, or, right? We will touch upon this more. But just to give, they then go further and estimate, just in the US, a pay scale of around $675 billion on just those jobs, these 13% jobs, which could benefit from this. All right, so I hope I gave you a little bit of an overview of the field, but now the question you might say, right, you showed us in the beginning some examples where NLP failed, right? You could think now, but okay, you have now these pre-trained language models. Could you just take them and train even larger ones than the ones we have, and that solves everything? And I think, I want to show you that I think it's very, language is my take on this question. So I try to answer this now in 3 parts. One is that language is so varies, right, all the time. We adjust it, we develop it, we adjust it to the speaker. But also, it's so, there's so many facets that go into it. If you speak about English, right, we had this example of which English do you mean, for instance. And so if I translate this into, for instance, German, you can think about, okay, maybe you can put the person into some space on the map even, right? So it's more than just a message. It's a lot of other dimensions that you also signal through language, which are very hard to model at the moment. So, and on the other hand, if you think about now these models that are there, they are trained on huge amount of data, but I argue that there is always a lack of data. We will never be having enough data to solve all of our problems. And so we can see this as like a long tail of languages. Some happen to have a much higher footprint, digital footprint, than others. And those are then the ones that, if you look at, for instance, the training data of a large multilingual model, there are certain languages which just, are well resourced, and others are very not well resourced. And that looks only at the language dimension, right? And in the same way, you could also think about, if you look at data that we in the field use and what kind of data is in there, so this is again multilingual data, then you see a lot of the technology is built on newswire data or non-fiction data, right? So this also biases how good these systems work and to which users they cater, essentially. Another aspect is training larger language models will make it very, very challenging to control and look for safety as well. And this is a subfield in itself, right? How to control the output that they generate. It's an interesting paper where they try to essentially control the type of output by thinking about attributes and trying to, in a way, condition on those in order to say, okay, I want a positive sentence generated, or I want some political topic around it. But much, much, much more needs to be done in this area, for instance, as well. And lastly, I want to touch upon an area which is not really mine, but I think it's crucial also in order to, think about training these larger models, or even downscaling them, or whatever, making resources more effectively used to work together with other people in other fields like data systems people. Because only the scaling up is non-trivial also from the technical side of point of sight. And for instance, I really like this by Matej Zaharia from Stanford, shows in a recent paper that even GPU parallel processing is really underusing the GPUs at the time, right? And tries to scale up a language model with some clever way to make it use the GPUs in a smarter way. And even they say that doing this again to the next magnitude will be very, very challenging. So it's non-trivial to do so. So my answer is no. I hope I have convinced you at least that scaling up is good to some degree, but that will not solve it. I believe that we need to take what we have now, these models, and enrich them, essentially, in order to build better NLP down the road. All right, do I have still time? Yeah? All right, then I will be rather quick. So I gave you a general perspective, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the research examples, if some of you are researchers here, to give you a taste of what we have been doing. My research at the moment is centered around these 3 goals of creating inclusive, efficient, and human-centered NLP. And what do I mean with this? Is this what I wanted to show you, at least with some examples, what we're doing currently. So one is trying to develop technology for low-resource languages. For instance, parsing is one of the tasks. But in general, low-resource languages, and when you do, even in case you had a lot of data available, often there is much more variety in the data, right? And training on the whole is actually not efficient. You might think, hey, I want to target analyzing speech data, transcription of speech, and I train on all of the data. That's not so good than selecting better training data. And in this paper, we were looking at sometimes you have additional information like metadata about the corpora you use, like genre, but they might not be for the data at hand. You need to project them down to the sentences and so on to use them. So in this work, we essentially looked at, hey, how can we transport original, like bird-based representation via exploiting these labels in order to be better in low-resource parsing. So amplifying this was actually beneficial for the task. So I leave it here. This was very quick, just to give you a taste that we are interested in finding these other weak supervision signals in order to improve these representations for low-scale, low-resource parsing in this case. Another point, which I believe is important, is better evaluation, right? That's also one thing where we often don't spend so much time on. And here is an example where we looked at these visual question answering agents, and we found, there are 2 systems, imagine now there, and they behave on accuracy levels similarly. But if you look then at the dialogues they generate, they are very different. So for instance, here it's, a lot of location question versus trying to ask about attributes. So finding out what the system is good for and how it relates to the humans is something I think is very important as well. So not just looking at accuracy. Then finally, one to the final one is, in many cases, we also learn from this mode that I already mentioned in the beginning. But we know when we give people data to annotate, that they differ, right? People differ, and then the labels differ, and usually we try to homogenize this. But often, there is signal in this data which isn't exploited. And so, for instance, in fact, we actually use only the gold standards, while there is possibly a lot of information, but of course also noise in the original annotations. So we proposed also to embrace that in learning in order to learn a better system. And finally, the last example is, we humans really like to actually not answer polar questions, right? If I ask you something where it's yes or no, you like to not answer yes or no. So this is a very subtle human argumentation strategy, but for a system that's tremendously difficult to do. I think this is yet another example where it makes a lot of sense to think about also the implications, right? And so here is an example of, we developed a new corpus on this task, and the key idea was to use movie or TV series transcripts to look for such polar questions and how they are answered. And then the task is to classify those into, is it a yes, is it a no, is it a maybe, or and so on. And this is a task which turns out to be also challenging for the human, right? And so in this data set, we created with my students 5,000 annotated question-answer pairs, and they annotated all of the data. So we could look also, when we train a system, on what are the errors the system makes on cases where all three annotators agree versus where humans disagree. And of course, then the system makes errors when the humans also disagree, right? So we can then try to model this disagreement, and we got some encouraging results. I think there's a lot more to make this more subtle inferences by the system in future. And to wrap up, this brings me to the end. Thanks a lot. So I hope I have shown you a little bit, by moving, by walking out this room, a little bit more about NLP. And it has grown really tremendously in last years. I want to reiterate what I said, that bias is everywhere, and being aware of that is really important. And really, this awareness is the key. This is an ongoing discussion. And that's why I'm also happy to be here today. And in a nutshell, my goal is to work towards more inclusive, like low-resource languages and so on, and more robust NLP. And with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much.
So if the goal is for the machines to learn and mimic human languages, I'm wondering if there's anyone looking at the reverse process where, for example, the imperfect grammar corrector in Word is becoming normative in the other direction.
The norm, like the noise is coming the norm, essentially.
Well, yeah, where people are like taking that as a normative grammar rule, so that's becoming... the flow is going backwards, so to speak, right? Where humans are learning from the not completely...
Yeah, but that also in a way happens on social media, or writing dialects in form and so on, right? So we'd say that's already happening perhaps, but maybe I didn't fully understand.
Well, in Microsoft Word, for example, it has a built-in grammar corrector. So it makes suggestions to your grammar.
Yes, yeah.
And so I'm wondering if people are... So the idea would be the grammar corrector be based on some machine learning that is learning how grammar is.
Yeah, yeah.
But a lot of people instead are learning from Microsoft Word's grammar correction. So the current state is becoming normative in human grammar in English.
Yeah, that's a good
I'm wondering
point.
if people are looking at that, or if you know.
That's a very good point. There are certainly studies that look at how, at least I know some who studied how grammar is taught at school and the implications in children. There's some in this side. But it's a good point of technology, right? If you deploy the technology, what are the implications? How do the users deal with this technology? And feeding this back, that's kind of the key. So yeah. And what's this norm? And where does it come from, right? It raises actually more questions than answers. Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah.
I think the last one you had with indirect questions was really interesting. I have a son that has autism, which has a hard time with that, and also with satire or irony, and I guess that is kind of lumped in the same kind of area where there is something between the lines, so to speak. So I mean, that would be I think a lot of humans have a problem with that as well. So I'm interested in seeing how the AI is going to solve that.
it's a nice way, as you said, reading between the lines, right? This is kind of, you can put this under this umbrella. I'm also very excited about this because it's such a difficult task for the machine and for us even. So often easy, but not, right? That also humans disagree a lot in these interpretations. But that's a good point, to make these more irony and those parts are also studied, but they are very difficult. So as long as you syntactic tasks and so on, they are okay, but even there we are not doing so great, And then if you move up the hierarchy in this more pragmatic, conversational lines, it's getting very, very difficult. So we are taking still, baby steps in some way, even though we have GDP3.
Another question? Yes.
Hello, and thanks for a nice talk. I have a question about what you said, that there are biases everywhere, but awareness is key. So I'm a research engineer in machine learning, and I train models in practice. And I know that there is a risk that if you train a language model or deploy a language model in practice, you might include some biases. For instance, you might unintentionally train a model that becomes has a racist bias, or perhaps a gender bias, or some other kind of bias. And in practice, awareness is really hard. It's sometimes impossible to look into these models. So I wonder if it's possible to say something about the responsibility in practice. When you deploy such a model, I mean, can you say something, or is it possible to start to say something about where the responsibility lies? Is it with the practitioner, or is it with the people who have generated the data, or is it somewhere else?
That's a very good question, and also a deep question, right? Where is the responsibility and so on? Difficult to answer, but I think the responsibility is all us together. So no one can decide. This should at least. It's not black and white, and that's the problem, right? Some people see it as black and white. We shouldn't do this, and we should try to regulate across all dimensions, which you mentioned, some gender or the data itself and so on, which is very, very difficult, right? To even think about are we inclusive? Can we even do this, right? But there is always, I think, in general, to release it, and then people can study it. At least from that side, it's very positive to make it accessible. But back to, okay, how do you release it? Are you employing it in a product that millions of people are using, or is it just that's then exactly the other way of the spectrum? Where are we going and releasing those models, which have direct impact on people, on technology that uses the technology even, and how do people then understand how biased, or how can then the trust emerge between the machine and the human, right? So I think it's, I'm not sure I answered, but...
No, I think you started to give a very good answer. It's just that in practice, in the software industry, for instance, it's typically timing is key, and the time to market is very important. So people are in a rush to get their product out, and so there's this difficult balance between investigating the models and actually, spending all your time investigating it.
Right. I think this touches also upon what we heard earlier, right? If in fact this, where are we going to the asylum kind of, it's all rushing, and the responsibility at the same time of the universities, because I think we have a crucial role also in making, the next generation of scientists to go to the technologies and maybe a little bit take the break, right? Hopefully, so that it's not so making socially responsible technology and make this as a key to understand when we release it or whether we release it. I think that's the key. But how to do it, and that's I don't know yet. That's a huge question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So listen to the speaker again. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good day, everyone. My talk, in some sense, is kind of complementary to the other three talks. So The title may not be clear yet, but it will be clear as I go into the talk. So again, as we heard from previous speaker, the last decades was almost a revolutionary decade in AI, and in particular in machine learning, specifically perhaps deep learning and reinforcement learning and deep reinforcement learning, etc. One of, I think, a key accomplishment was in about 5 years ago, AlphaGo from DeepMind beating Lee Sedol in the game of Go, which was always considered much more difficult than chess. Chess, we solved the problem already in the 90s, but Go was a major accomplishment. But in parallel to all, and every university now hires machine learning and has data science initiative and so on and so forth. But at about the same time, we discovered the problem of bias, for example. And in 2016, ProPublica published an expose about software that's being used to predict future criminals, and it gives identical those folders. They just changed the identity of one of the defendants to be black versus white, and we discovered the system is biased against blacks because you learn from the data, and those who learn from history seem to be doomed to repeat it. If I can make a paraphrase. And then weapons of mass destruction came out, and all the dangers of bias in big data start coming out as the field continued to grow. And that has led towards the end of the decade, many have declared we have an ethics crisis. And these are just a collection of headlines from newspaper: tech ethical dark side, ethics crisis, we need chief ethics officer. And Facebook is such an ethical company that they have even given $7.5 million to the Technical University in Munich for Institute of Ethics in AI. So we heard a lot about ethics. And you can go and you find how Google has a page about responsible AI. And they are telling us how they're going to behave very, very responsibly. And you can find as a partnership for AI and lots of declarations about how we are all going to be very ethical. In 2018, Beck Warner, a Dutch philosopher, wrote an article, Ethics as an Escape from Regulation, from ethics washing to ethics shopping. And in a nutshell, he argued, much of the debate about ethics seems to provide an easy alternative to government regulation. And I agree with Wagner, and I want to elaborate on this point. So let's compare computing technology to another technology that was revolutionary, and that was the automobile. The automobile is about 1908 was the mass-produced, first mass-consumed car, the Ford Model T. And as cars starting, we have more and more cars, we discover that people get killed. And so we have dealt now a century in trying to deal with reduced fatalities by automobiles. And we have reduced it by about a factor of 50. People measure it by fatalities per billion vehicles mile travel, VMT, vehicles mile travel. And we've been able to reduce it over the 100 years by a factor of 50, which is very impressive. And we did it by many measures, trying to build better cars, mirrors, and anti-lock brakes. And then accident will happen, so let's have airbags and safe seat belts. And we change we change how cities are structured. We have crosswalk and we have traffic lights, and we have laws: driving while intoxicated, driving while texting. What we did not say the solution would be ethic training for drivers. Nobody ever thought that this would be a solution. What we had is what I call the collection of these measures. I would call it public policy. This is all the way from how you build cars, how you license drivers, how you build a city. All of this I would call it public policy. Now let's contrast it with, for example, how machine learning is used in the justice system. So in April 2017, John G. Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States, visited Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and had a fireside chat with the president, Shirley Ann Jackson. And she asked him whether he can foresee a day when smart machines driven artificial intelligences will assist with courtroom fact-finding, or more controversial even, judicial decision-making. And he replied with affirmation and concern. It's a day that's here, and it's putting a significant strain on how the judiciary goes about doing things. The New York Times described it as an algorithm that grants freedom or takes it away. So let's use a little parable here. Let me show you my dog, Fluffy, who is a very well-trained dog. And it's a black lab, very cute. And I trained Fluffy to detect risk of recidivism. And I took Fluffy to the federal court system here in Houston, and its accuracy has been tested. But as you can see, Fluffy is a black box, literally, and does not provide explanations. Now, would we trust Fluffy to make parole decisions? Should we give Fluffy ethics training? Of course, everybody understands it's a joke. We're not going to let Fluffy make parole decision. So how is Fluffy different than GPT-3 or some version of GPT-3 that's going to make judicial decision? And the answer is, I can't see much difference. It's a big neural net, and all we can say, it works. But we don't think it's good enough with Fluffy. You should not be good enough with GPT-3 to make such decision. Now let me go and elaborate on another example, which we all live on right now, the internet. So if you want to understand, and I'm referring not to the internet, not just as TCP/IP, but the whole ecosystem, what we call the internet. And if you want to understand its root of the social media in particular, you go to 1980s. I was then a postdoc in the Bay Area, and there was the Well, which was one of the very first, it was a dial-up bulletin board. There was Usenet, Unix to Unix network, which was a worldwide distributed discussion board. These are the roots of social media system of today. But the atmosphere then, we just came out of the 60s in the United States. People really talk about the early 70s. And it was the area of protest against the Vietnam War, and it was very anti-disestablishment. In fact, there was even a word, anti-disestablishmentarianism. And so the hippie movement was very anti-government, and out of this movement came the mantra, information wants to be free. And so when Tim Berners-Lee in the late 80s created the World Wide Web, his motto was unfettered public sharing of information. Now, at the beginning, it was exhilarating, but very quickly we discovered there is a problem. There's too much information. TMI, how do you find information on the World Wide Web? There's too much. Now, early solution, for example, by companies such as Yahoo, doesn't exist anymore. Does the website exist? It was how do you find books in library? There is a catalog. So they said, let's build a catalog for the internet. But the internet was growing too fast for this to scale. Then they said, no, we need search engines. The first search engines were just not very good. Then Google came up with the PageRank algorithm, a fantastically good search algorithm, and we all started using Google. It became a verb to Google something. Now, Google was influenced by this information wants to be free. So search is free. So how do you form a company? How do you monetize free information? So Google has a brilliant idea. Well, advertising work for other media, for newspaper, which are subsidized greatly by advertising. Broadcast TV was funded in many countries just purely on advertising. Let's use this, Google said. But they quickly discovered that online advertising is very ineffective. If you make large banners, then people hate it, and small advertisement, people wouldn't click it. So the next brilliant idea was micro-targeted advertising. Match the ad to the person. So for that, you need lots of personal data and much more than you can imagine. It's not just about what you can scrape from the browser, but for example, Google collects information for MasterCard, for example. So lots of data. Lots of collection of data. And it really means that we're using machine learning, I would say, on steroids. It's all about targeted advertising based on personal data. Just to see a very simple example, if you do a search, what is Exxon, you might get an advertisement like on the right, talking about unnecessary regulation, slow our economy down, or you will get an advertisement about CO2 capture. And which advertisement do you see? The anti-regulation or the green advertisement will depend on what Google think on Google's profile of you. So we all affected by this on a daily basis. We just don't realize it. Somebody already mentioned earlier Shoshana Zuboff's book that came in 2019, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. She coined the phrase surveillance capitalism, which is the business model of many, many internet companies. And the slogan in Silicon Valley is, if you're not paying for it, you are the product. So Google distinguishes between users and customers. All of us, most of us, that is to say, are just users. The customers are the people who pay the bills. These are advertising companies. What does Google sell them? Well, data about us. They tell us, they tell Google how they want the advertisement directed, and that's what Google do. So we are we are the users and we are the product. After the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., Shoshana Zuboff wrote an article in the New York Times, the coup we are not talking about. And she wrote, we can have a democracy or we can have surveillance society, but we cannot have both because knowledge is power. And right now there is a huge, what should we call, epistemic inequality. The tech companies knows, and we have no idea what's happening under the cover. Now, how well has this business model worked for Google? The answer is fabulously well. I mean, Google by now is making almost $150 billion a year just from advertisement. I mean, that's still the main, Google started other businesses, but the main source of income for Google is the advertising business. So this has been a brilliant business model. Now, suppose we send Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the two co-founders of Google and still major shareholders, we send him to an ethics bootcamp, maybe by the one that the Institute of Ethics and AI in Munich is running, funded by Facebook. Do you think that after a week of ethics bootcamp, they're going to go back to Silicon Valley and tell the people for Google, oh, this was all a big mistake. Let's change this business model. $150 billion a year, they're not going to change it. They're not going to give it up easily. But 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, I wrote, if society finds the surveillance business model offensive, then in my opinion, the remedy is public policy in the forms of laws and regulation rather than ethics outrage. But right now, there is still the regulatory regime does not exist yet, and Google is stuck between what I would call its ethics facade and its fundamentally unethical business model, which is preying on our personal data and selling it to advertisers. And this contradiction is something that Google is just struggling with. So there was a scandal of Timnit Gebru. This is Wired magazine from June of this year, and Wired magazine wrote about Timnit Gebru. She was a star engineer who warned that messy AI can spread racism. Google brought her in, then it forced it out. Can big tech take criticism from within? And the scandal has been unfolding now. In December of 2020, the Timnit was fired. A couple of months later, her manager, Margaret Mitchell, was fired. In March of this year, AI Ethics Research Conference, FATE Star, Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, Equity Star, kicked out Google as a sponsor. They says, take your money and go away. Your money stinks. We don't want you as a sponsor. Google was decided. I said, okay, we're going to change our technology. They have something new, Flock. We will see how this is going to work out. So Google is stuck between its ethics facade and the reality that its business model is fundamentally unethical. Now, people say, yeah, but I'm getting all these services from Google for free. But Google is making $150 billion a year from advertising. Where does the money come from? Alex Webb on Bloomberg wrote the whole web pays for Google and Facebook to be free. The answer is, of course, we pay for this because the advertising pay for it nominally, but they just pass the cost to the consumers. So we pay for Google services, but in an opaque way. So we got mass surveillance, and we are still paying for it, except we are not seeing it because it's a hidden tax on everything you buy today. And if, again, some people argue is, oh, well, but people know and are willing to do this exchange of their data for the free services. Very few people really understand what's going on. It turns out that when Pew did a survey of Facebook users, and it turns out that 75% don't know that Google keeps a profile of them. And when you show them the profile, they're uncomfortable with it. And 27% disagree with Facebook characterization. I myself, I'm in a dilemma. I think of myself as political centrist. Facebook says that I'm extremely liberal. So I don't even know who is right. Is Facebook correct or am I correct? Is my perception right or is Facebook correct? I bet in this audience, 90+% of the people have used Gmail. But how many of you have read Google terms of Gmail terms of services? The answer is usually you find very few people have read Gmail terms of services. So what is it about? Is it an ethics problem or it's a public policy? I would argue this is a public policy issue. Now, why is it that there is almost no IT public policy? And one reason is because the tech industry today is a huge industry. If you go to the big tech companies, and it is Apple and Alphabet and Amazon and Microsoft and Facebook, their market equity today is near $10 trillion. $10 trillion. It's more than 25% of the S&P 500. This is a hugely powerful industry. And this industry has fought for years against regulation under the mantra regulation stifles innovation. A few years ago, Elon Musk was investigated by the Security and Exchange Commission in the United States because of some tweets that seemed to have aimed at manipulating the stock price. And Wired magazine, a very techy magazine, wrote, the case against Elon Musk will chill innovation. God forbid we investigate Elon Musk for breaking the law, because it will chill innovation. So technology is driving the future. That's very clear to us. We are all realizing that the world, today is very different than the world that it was a generation ago, and we can just project that in another generation the world will be even more different. But who is driving? Who's doing the steering? The answer is it's not the public. It's tech corporation, because technology has moved very fast, and public policy has lagged behind. And while Silicon Valley keep talking about innovation, we should remember innovation is means to an end. And the end is societal progress. Innovation per se, if everything was perfect, we don't need innovation. Of course, the answer is it's not perfect. But is technology making things better? That's not very clear. Now, I want to go back to ethics. Is ethics important? Of course, ethics is important. I'm not saying that we should ignore ethics. There was recently a Rome call for AI ethics. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Well, who can disagree with that? And we heard some of the earlier ethical issues talk about exactly this kind of principle about the human rights. And Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in the 60s, wrote, in civilized life, the law floats in a sea of ethics. That is to say, ethics should inform public policy. But the law is institutionalized. We have a justice system. We don't have the ethics system. With the exception of some profession where ethics is the power of law, which is the law profession and the medical profession, in other areas, ethics is just something nice to have, but it's not binding. Now, it became very clear over the last couple of years that regulation is coming. I start talking about the need for regulation in 2019. And people were saying, oh my goodness, you're going to destroy technology. What are you talking about? But now, even the tech CEOs are saying we need regulation. And the reason, of course, they said we need regulation because they think it's coming anyway and they want to influence it. It's not, they're not saying it because of concern to our lives. They're realizing it's going to happen. They want to steer it in the right direction, I mean the right direction for them. And you can see this is coming from Apple, from Facebook, from Alphabet, from Microsoft. All of them are now talking about regulation. We need to do tech regulation. The biggest, I think, the regulatory challenge is what I would call the social trilemma. And in New York Times article, Emily Bazelon wrote, "Why is big tech policing speech? Because the government is not." And why I call it the social trilemma? We are uncomfortable with the government regulating speech. We are uncomfortable with Silicon Valley regulating speech. But if nobody regulates speech, then we know that we have a problem. We have misinformation and disinformation and hateful speech and bad speech and all and so on and so forth. And we are stuck between this dilemma. What do we do about this massive amount of speech that happens? Who is going to regulate it or not regulate it? This is what I call, this is to me the main the regulatory challenge right now. So in an article on NextWeb last year, Tristan Green wrote about the ethics of AI. And he said, when we discuss the ethics of AI, we're asking two simple questions. Is it ethical to build an AI for this specific purpose? And is it ethical to build an AI with these capabilities? And I think this lens is too narrow. I think we should also ask who benefits, who decides, and I should add to that, who gets harmed equally. We need to ask who gets harmed. Kate Crawford in 2021, this year, wrote an article and she says, stop talking about AI ethics. It's time to talk about power. And so far, power is yielded by the tech companies. I'll conclude with a slogan that comes from BMW. So BMW, their slogan used to be the ultimate driving machine. Well, now they're facing this prospect of autonomous vehicles. So the new slogan, their new slogan is, don't be driven by technology, drive it. I think this slogan is appropriate for society as a whole. Don't be driven by technology, drive it. Thank you very much.
Moshe, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Yeah, so we will open here the floor for a couple of questions before we watch a coffee break.
I'm open to questions.
It seems that there are no... here this one.
So Moshe, you talked about...
Sorry, since Moshe cannot see you, maybe you can say your name first.
Hi Moshe, this is Devdat here. You're talking about government regulation as a way to, as an instrument of public policy to check the tech corporations. But is even that enough? I mean, what if there is regulatory capture? I mean, especially in the United States, this is a major problem. I mean, you have these huge lobby groups in Washington and so on. So is just regulation by government going to do anything about it, given that that's very susceptible to regulatory capture by the same big tech companies?
You're absolutely right. And there's no magical solution to this issue. I mean, interestingly, this issue comes back if you look at American history, you go back to the beginning of the 20th century. One of the major issues was the companies, the big tech at the time were the oil companies. And Theodore Roosevelt went to a big fight against what is become known as trust busting. So perhaps one way we deal with, for example, Facebook is not by having just more and more elaborate rules about content moderation, but saying the main problem in Facebook is just too large and too powerful. And so we already see that the Biden administration hired some antitrust activists. And I think some trust busting is going to be easy. I mean, we need to force Facebook to spin off WhatsApp and Instagram. They should never be allowed to buy WhatsApp and Instagram. So that will first of all will make the Facebook a smaller company. Just right now, Facebook controls the speech of I think 3.5 billion people on the planet. Almost 50% of humanity. This is between Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. So I think they should be broken up, at least along this line. Even Facebook itself, just look at Facebook itself, social media, even that is too large. And this is a more difficult question of how do you control it. And there are some ideas, like Cory Doctorow is just wrote in the last issue of Communication of the ACM, and he said what you have to do is you have to force them to open the content. Imagine that the content is open. So, and that means that one company just store the information. But imagine that there could be many different content moderation companies. You can decide that I will not go with Facebook content moderation, but maybe Vardy will start a company doing its own content moderation. So there will be competition about content moderation. Right now we don't have it. So there are lots of ideas how to do that, but we always have to remember the first sentence of the American Constitution. We the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, not a perfect union, but a more perfect union. So we will continue to struggle with technology, and we will try something and they will not work, they will fail, and we will seek a remedy for that failure. And this is going to continue. But just because some things are hard, Houston Rice University is famous for a speech that President Kennedy gave about going to the moon. It was announced, the program going to the moon was announced on the campus of Rice University. And he says, we want to go to the moon, not because it is easy, because it is hard. So let's find a way to regulate technology, not because it's easy, but because it's hugely important to our democracy.
One more question.
Yep.
I have one then, Gerardo speaking here. You mentioned Cory Doctorow, and reminds me this short story about this bread machine that can only make bread of a certain kind. Yeah, and I guess that the kind of regulation you are mentioning can definitely, those kind of things, technology you could regulate, but this high tech, as Dev mentioned, they are lobbying, mostly in the United States. They are global, yeah? And then you put some public regulations in the United States, and what happened in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, or Latin America. I mean, it happened before with other technologies, and then you regulate medicaments in Europe, and they sell it to Latin America, yeah? So how would you see this kind of public regulation at a global scale?
So we have struggled before with issues of the right balance between individual countries have their own legal systems, and the fact to have some kind of global coordination. We've done it successfully, for example, with the ozone hole. That was a success of international cooperation, collaboration. You go back to the 19th century, we passed treaties. We passed treaties of the sea. We dealt with piracy. Requires some kind of international collaboration. We need to do we need to go back to think, climate change is something very clear. We need some kind of international collaboration. So some aspect of technology, we are going to let different countries make their own decision. And some we will need to deal with, take the problem of like ransomware now. To me, it's very close with piracy. So as we need to figure out how to take some of these challenging issues, policy issues, and what is the global coordination that we're going to do dealing with these policy issues.
Okay, so now is a panel discussion, and I will leave now to Ule here, who will be moderating the panel. You were not much at the very beginning, so I could very briefly introduce Ule. He's a professor in mathematics here, Professor Ule Ekström, and Yeah, you maybe if you want to introduce to Moshe very quickly, because Moshe was not present at the beginning. And in fact, did you manage to hear all the talks?
No, I was sitting on Zoom at the beginning, not on Teams at the beginning for about 15 minutes before I could hear anything. So I only heard the last part of Amanda's talk.
Okay, but then I will say,
not enough to fully understand it.
Yeah, so I would suggest then, because of that, then maybe all of you make a very short presentation. I let the floor to you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for I mean, these were 4 wonderful talks by Amanda and Devdat, Barbara, and Moshe, and I'm very honored to sit here and lead this discussion, and to not steer this too much. I'd like to simply start by inviting you to react to each other's talks. How about Amanda, if you go first? What made the most impression on you?
Well, Devdat, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I was reacting to something interesting you were saying about how AI researchers can become more sensitive to social consequences of their actions. So maybe you were citing someone, or that was also your position, I guess. And I would like you to elaborate on how you could become more sensitive in your own work. How is it done? I suspect that you are reflecting on that a lot in your work too. So that was one question, and
maybe we take them one at a time.
Yes.
You put me on the spot there.
But perhaps also not only socially aware, but the human, as I would say, consequences and the social consequences of the research you're conducting.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that, like many of my colleagues and so on, we normally don't have that as one of our focus items. When you're doing your research, you're probably focused more on the technical aspect and other ways that you find it interesting, and very rarely do you think about the longer-term, broader consequences of it. And that particular line that I had there on my slide was actually a quote from that same article by Acemoglu, but I do absolutely heartily agree with that. And exactly how that should be done, I don't know, but I think such forums like this are one way to start this kind of a dialogue. And I think it's not an easy thing, because there are certain differences that were apparent, the gaps in not only in the thinking, but even in the way one talks, in the vocabulary and so on. So it's probably going to take some amount of cross-disciplinary communication before that kind of interchange starts.
Yes, and some translation work across our fields or traditions, scientific traditions. Can I ask another one?
I just want to comment.
Okay.
I think this is a wonderful point, and it reminds me a little bit about the point that was raised by Carl Define Licht in an earlier workshop in September on the teaching of ethics to engineering students. And he pointed out that sometimes the students pick up like the procedure for algorithmically how to address ethical problems, but they don't internalize it. It's not something that they really stand for or will be prepared to defend to their friends and so on. They just know the procedure. And I think this very same phenomenon can happen also, of course, on the level of researchers. So thank you for bringing this up.
Yeah.
You had further...
No, I would just like to say also that I really appreciated what you were saying, that we need to move from this mindset of efficiency to what is a good life, a good society, which we have to talk about together. And I just want to say that. Yeah, that was good.
That was on my notes to react to your talk as well.
Let's hear.
Well, I mean, I had this exact thing that when you talked about the good life, was it, did we have a connection there when, that quote from John Maynard Keynes, was that also what you were talking about?
Yes.
When you talked about the good life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. and a life of flourishing with our technologies.
Very nice. Let's hear from Houston. Was there anything in particular that you did pick up in the other talks that you want to comment on?
So I want to start by going back to the same issues of our responsibility, what I would call social responsibility. And I would argue that our main challenge now as a profession is to deal with the fact that as a community, especially the research community, is spread between academia and industry. Now, it's very easy to say, okay, we are the academics, they are the industry, but the reality is that many of us sometimes get funding from industry, and you see many researchers who spend, academics who spend part of their time in industry, students go to industry, and, you know, just to, let's just now, you know, maybe it's arguable position, but let's suppose that this is the tobacco industry. Okay, and we are in the tobacco, we are the academics of the tobacco. And what's our responsibility there? And I'll just give you an example to me, which is now, it's a quandary, and I don't have an elegant solution, an elegant answer to that. But, you know, the Turing Award was given this for last year, was given this year is for Aaron Ullman. And then claims came that Ullman had express anti-Iranian sentiments, and therefore it's a violation of ACM Code of Ethics, and people argue. And now, any nomination for ACM, you must also say, okay, you know, do you know that this person has violated ACM Code of Ethics? And now my question is, should we say that everybody that works for Facebook, given especially the most recent revelation, should we argue that everybody who works for Facebook is violating ACM Code of Ethics? Because it's very clear that Facebook is putting profits before human consideration. And so, I mean, you look at the Turing Award right now, is $1 million a year, it's funded by Google. So I think there is, to me, one of the issues is what does it mean to have social responsibility? How seriously do we take it? And how do we deal with the fact that we are the academic side of an industry that more and more comes across as the tobacco industry?
Right. Yes. On this topic of industry sponsoring academia, I want to take the opportunity to put Amanda on the spot in the same way that you put Devdat on the spot. Namely, you work on AI ethics with money from the Wallenberg Foundation.
I'm not afraid to speak my mind about these matters or to suggest that we need a reframing of the whole debate in terms of moving away from inevitabilism, solutionism. Maybe we should redefine ethics beyond how it's defined by industry. Maybe we can marry a powerful or a sophisticated power analysis to our definition of ethics together across, in a coalition, so to speak, across the STEM groups, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, humanities, and social sciences. Maybe that's where we can begin. Maybe we can form a coalition against simplifying reductionist modes of defining what is at stake and what is, what we should do as a society. So I think we, as academics, must be very active, and especially if you have funding from the Wallenbergs.
Yeah. You say many radical things, but I mean, no matter how radical things you say, I could object that, well, this is part of the Wallenberg Foundation's ethical whitewashing.
I'm part of the whitewashing, yeah. And I'm fully aware of that, that it can be interpreted that way. And I think I have heard some colleagues commenting upon the WASP-HS funding or the whole project as being an example of that. But I think we, each and every one of us, have the responsibility to be very clear about these power dimensions. And I mean, the academic republic is still free, is it not?
Do you want to address this point?
Well, the academic sphere is a little freer, and I think it's a little freer than it is over there where Moshe lives. I think one of the things in the Swedish system is we don't get direct funding normally from industry. I mean, the Wallenberg thing is a bit of an exception, but we don't get direct funding from industry. So in that sense, it's a little freer than where in the US you get direct funding from industry. So I just wanted to quickly react to your 2 points, Moshe, about the 2 examples you gave. So one, well, with these recent hearings on Facebook, I mean, I think they showed what was happening in the Facebook, leadership, the executives and the CEOs, and not about the Facebook engineers. So there is a little bit of difference, but of course you can say that the engineers also work for the company. But I think direct responsibility there was much more that the executives and the bosses were the ones who were fully aware of what they were doing, and not so much the engineers. And the second one, the example you gave of Ullman, I don't think it contradicts any ethical behavior, whatever policies. I mean, you might have some personal opinions that the action he did was a little personally distasteful, but I don't think he violated any rules on that.
No. My point was not about saying anything. I tried not to say anything about judgments, but the point is there was an ethics kerfuffle, or a commotion, an ethic commotion about Ullman. And I would describe Ullman's, at least in the US legal system, there are different degrees when we talk about criminal law. There are infraction and misdemeanor and felony. Okay, there are 3 grades. Infraction is illegal parking, for example. So, you may have done it yourself, probably all of us at some point, maybe we're in a hurry and park somewhere, maybe only allowed to park 2 hours, and you park 2.5 hours, you broke the law, okay? But we all understand one important thing about ethics is to put things in a proper perspective. So what I'm trying to say is that whatever Ullman's infraction was, it is dwarfed by what we're hearing about Facebook. And I don't see ACM standing up and saying, well, nobody said when Jan LeCun received the Turing Award, nobody said, wait a minute, he's working for Facebook, you should not get the Turing Award. So it's easy to pick up on small infraction, while the big felonies go unchallenged because they are done by powerful industry. And I would say at least one thing as academics, we have one responsibility: speak truth to power. Okay? I think that if we are not using our privileged position in academia to do that, then we are shirking our moral responsibility. So you want to take money from industry? If you let it suppress your opinions, then it's a Faustian bargain. If you are willing to take money from Facebook and still continue to criticize Facebook, and Facebook continue to fund you, okay, well, we can live with it.
So
I want to raise another point about to Devdat, about the Elysium parable, because in some sense we're all living in Elysium. And I think talking about the science fiction, what will happen in the future, and AI, and how this big GPT-3 will automate jobs, we, especially in the United States, where we have very weak, what we have seen over the past generation of 40 years now, is first of all, there was the growth of technology on one hand. So 1981 was a very important year in US history, because 3 things happened in 1981. Number 1, I arrived as a postdoc. Just joking. Number 2, Reagan became president. Number 3, the IBM PC was introduced and changed the world. But if you take this new liberal doctrine, which was laissez-faire, let the companies do whatever they want pretty much, and the explosion of technology, we have seen, and globalization, we have already seen what's became known as labor polarization. And this means that educated professionals like us, and usually it means our friends and our families, have actually fared fairly well because it's become the knowledge-based economy. And so educated people, educated professionals have done well. But you look at working class people, they have not done so well. If you look at working class men, so these are men with high school education or less, between ages 25 and 55. This is called prime age men, beyond education, before retirement. 1 in 5 working class men is not working. Now, it does not show up in unemployment statistics, because unemployment is defined as people who are looking for a job and are not finding jobs. So if you stop looking for a job, you're not unemployed anymore, according to the statistics. But if you ask how many people are not working, and the answer is 1 in 5. And this is already a social calamity. And if you want to understand what's happening politically in the United States, you don't need to go farther than that. You want to find one variable that will predict whether or not you vote for Trump, you have college education or not. So this, and if you think what happened during the pandemic, most of us went to work from home, but the only way I can work from home is by having a whole class of people delivering the food to my doorstep. And these people had to continue to work. They didn't have the option of working from home.
Very good. I now want to give Barbara the opportunity to raise whatever highlights she noted in the other talks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So what I was really happy to see is that we actually agree on so many points and raised also similar points, even within topics like touching up on the job market came through all of our talks essentially, and the importance of the ethical dimension there. I really liked, drawing this parallel to the extreme case, Elysium, which I didn't know the movie. So in a way, yeah, we are in a way a little bit there already. I agree with Moshe on that. So this driving force of two-class system in a way, right? In rough terms, which is there, and then the connection which really struck me is to academics and the next generation and how we form the next generation of students. That's something which really touches upon me, and to raise awareness there in this, because it has so much impact. But this academic, that we really have to take leadership here and speak up and raise these points is something I really like to see, throughout all of our talks here. Yeah, that's mostly it. I like quite positive comment here.
Any comments in response to this?
I also felt that there were many resonances across our talks, maybe more than I had expected to some extent. When I heard you talk, Barbara, I felt that it was sort of kind of mirroring what I was trying to say about being human. You mentioned the complexities of human expression, that is disagreement. Can you capture that in the model? Gray areas, what's between the lines, indirect questions, all of that. That's, for me, deeply existential themes, basically. So my question to you is, if it's time for questions now, is that I was thinking that the models in themselves seem to me to be, as soon as they are in place, a bit normative. That's how I understand them, because I don't properly understand the model itself. So are you looking to sort of create that perfect model that can encompass people who cannot read between the lines, as well as people who always move between the lines in their communication? Do you know what I'm saying? The kind of, the spectrum of being human itself, is that what you're aiming to be able to describe? And what are your existential reflections on the very process itself of trying to achieve that?
Those are many questions, really, really deep questions, and really good questions. In fact, I like how you summarize it, that we are touching upon this existential question of human beings and the way we express them, and as we, communicate and understand each other. Versus, you completely got it right. The models, we could summarize them, are normative to high degrees at the moment. That's right, because we are we are regressing to a mean, in fact, right, in many ways, in getting the labels, aggregating the labels, and then in that way trying to simulate a single perspective, global perspective, right? So now, next question is who do we model? Are those the people who can read between the lines versus not between the lines? That's a very good question and to think about, because the question is then, it raises a lot of things on how you model it, or even have you thought about that question before starting to do this project, right? That's the next question that comes to my mind. I think in general, as putting this perspective on top, that the human is so diverse, is something we don't capture well, because we lump it all into its data often, right? But it's linguistic samples of conversations, and it's very hard to really model it properly because we have limited samples as well of how to do it. So it's a bit of a dilemma, I would say, to not model it. You model the variety in terms of limited resources, in rough terms. But by going a little bit against this and thinking about, the implications of the modeling in these terms of, between the lines or not between the lines, or disagreement or not, and maybe linking them to the technical side on how much information can we get about it, or how sparse is the signal, is this actually learnable, then that could be a way forward. But it's a big way forward, I would say.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, Barbara, which is possibly correlated with Amanda's question. Namely, so you talked quite a lot about biases in NLP models. And this brings me to ask myself, and now I ask you, is the concept of an unbiased NLP model really, does it make sense? I mean, my point of view differs from your point of view. So if you manage to build an NLP system which is perfectly unbiased from your point of view, it will show biases from my point of view. You could try to address this by making the system unbiased with respect to some average of people's point of view. But that would create absurdities such as, unbiasedness would then be some compromise between the Earth is round theory versus the Earth is flat. And I could mention examples about vaccine and so on to make it a little bit more. But do you agree with me that this may be problematic?
Yes. So you mentioned, so the question is there such a thing as an unbiased NLP, right, model, in a sense, because we have all these biases and how we need to deal with them, but can we, in the end, even solve this problem in a way? You're right. No, I don't think there is, an unbiased NLP model, because it's always relative, and in the perspective of the user or the for what do we deploy it? Why do we create it? There is always this question at the end, right? As well, because sometimes keeping some of the information is actually crucial to undercover. But what's the end goal? What is this used for? Needs to be asked as well.
But what you were talking about is, that's not so much bias and unbiased versus fact and non-fact.
Okay.
Right? At least those examples you gave. So
yeah, fact versus values.
The Earth being round versus Earth being flat is not fact versus value. It's fact versus nonsense.
Okay. Yes.
Vaccines and non-vaccine, again, it's of the same sort as well. So when you say unbiased, you probably mean unbiased, say...
Not nonsense.
not nonsense, but...
To how to address the biases. That's what I mean with being unbiased, right? If you could solve this but not to make it... how do you say it?
I guess the bias there, the example there would be, as it was in Moshe's talk about ProPublica, that there is obviously some bias against black Africans in the kind of judgments that are made against them and so on. So that's the notion of bias and that you're talking about as well.
Exactly. One of the notions of biases, in fact, is attributes you can think about.
Yeah. So if you look more closely at that example with North Point's compass algorithm, and I don't know exactly to whom I'm addressing this question. If any one of you can answer it, it's very good. But if you look more closely at what that algorithm does and the way it's biased, there are different notions of bias that you can have. You can ask for the algorithm to have the same false positive rates and the same false negative rates for blacks and for whites. And that's one notion that seems important. And there's another notion which is called the algorithm being calibrated. And I don't want to spend time here on the technical details of what this actually means, but these are like different directions in which to take the conditional probabilities. And it turns out that unless you are very, very lucky with what the distribution of vad heter det nu? Återfalls sannolikhet.
Recidivism.
Yes. How that is distributed in the population. It will not be possible to attain these two criteria simultaneously. It's simply mathematically impossible. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question which shows that there is no mathematical definition of what is the right model there. And
so Michael Kerens wrote a book recently about fair algorithms. And the point is that there is no absolute definition of fairness, okay? I mean, and bias. I mean, they're all, you need to connect them to societal values. I mean, for example, take the issue of discrimination and job discrimination. And so it's completely legal in the United States to deny me a job because I don't have a full mane of hair. But on the other hand, if you deny me a job because I have a big afro, then you can say that I'm discriminated against because of race. So we have, the law actually declared very clear categories on which discrimination is not allowed. And other than that, discrimination is allowed. And so the point is not to justify the law, but to point out that fairness and biases you must connect them to societal values.
And it will
I have another question to Barbara, which is, I don't think I heard you talk about this other fact that it connects to our earlier discussion that today only large corporations have the means to build these large models. And so I go back to Kate Crawford that says, don't talk about ethics, talk about power. And to me, kind of the big danger is that this corporation are this new technology, this big, very big, powerful, large model, what they call foundation model, which I think is a dubious term, but it's the only corporation that have, the only organization that have the means to deploy this technology are large corporations. And that to me is a very kind of scary situation.
Yeah, that was a very good quote, because that spoke to me right in the heart, because in fact in NLP we cannot do a lot of the, these big models. We don't have simply the machinery to even run them sometimes, not even speaking about training them. That's out of our zone. So this is an issue, and we need to. I agree that we need to think about who has the power and how homogeneously or how heterogeneously that is distributed is going to be a crucial question, which you also touched a lot upon in your talk. And in fact, also, that's what to do about it. That's the question. I don't have an answer to this. I also think taking funding, closing off the funding to academics now is not the route to go. I don't believe that's no way, because we need funding to go further, right? We need basic research. We need to be able to raise questions which they don't, raise, which they are not interested in, perhaps, or even simply don't raise, because they live in this more, accuracy boosting up world in a way. But
what if government gives you that funding? Say government gives you this very large infrastructure.
Yeah, wonderful. Give me infrastructure. No, but I think, as I hopefully also showed in my talk, I'm honestly a bit worried because there is this, at least in our field, homogenization of research, right? That everyone is expected now to use BERT or work with BERT, or just as a metaphor for many of those transformer-based models. I think it's crucial to raise awareness also in our students to, hey, there's so much more. There's so much more problems. And to not, reduce it to simple things, right, in a way. Just to give an example, transfer learning is now equivalent to fine-tuning models. But that's just ridiculous. It's not just that. There's so many other techniques out there that you can use and study. But it has been just a naming shift, right, in this direction. So raise that there is much more diverse things to look at, and hopefully to some degree also get the hand on powerful machines, because otherwise we can't do much, but not leave it in the hands of a few who then, have the power entirely.
But do I understand you correctly that even in the presence of this extremely uneven distribution of infrastructure, technical resources, there is still a meaningful role to be played by research groups at medium-sized universities like ITU Copenhagen and Chalmers?
Yes, there is, and there should be, and we should fight for keeping that. Because otherwise, if in 10 years from now the small research groups have disappeared, then we are all, collecting or together just forming the next generation of homogeneous people who fit into the same direction. And I don't think that, I really am I favor diversity in many aspects, also in research. I think that is what we should strive for. There's so many things to look at. We saw it, right? That language is so complex. There are so many issues to solve, and we need to reach out to other disciplines where we can learn a lot from, for instance, which industry perhaps is not interested or doesn't dare to do at the moment. So I'm torn, on one side we need the technology and we need to study technology, but we also need to diversify in some way, because we just cannot all do the same things. Then we don't have new knowledge that's being produced in the long run.
Since we're all agreeing, can I voice a disagreement?
Sure.
And that's to address to Moshe, because to me there was a contradiction in things you said. So on the one hand, so I'll pick up on two things you said. One, you said, speak truth to power. On the other hand, you said, you talked a lot about ethics washing. And to me, these are contradictory, because let's say you say truth to power. Well, the power, as the Facebook Senate hearings revealed, the Facebook executives knew perfectly well what the truth was. They knew perfectly well what they were doing. They actually knowing that what they were doing was harmful, they actively did it in order to boost their profits. That was crystal clear from these Senate hearings. So if you speak truth to them, that's not going to change anything. They knew it already. So perhaps you should speak truth to the public. Maybe that's where the public needs to become more aware, and that's where the getting more awareness in the public is what one needs to do.
So, speaking truth to power is a broad term, and, it may be that in some situation you should go and talk to someone privately, okay, and it may be effective, okay, and tell them the thing that they don't want to hear. In other situation, you're absolutely right. There's no point in talking to them, and you go to the category of becoming a whistleblower. And actually, what's interesting about the recent Facebook whistleblower is how carefully she planned the whole thing, okay? And she basically knew that she's going against a very powerful corporation, so she did it very well. She amassed the data. It was very well planned, the whole thing. So I don't think of speaking truth to power as a simplistic recipe, but as a more and broader thing. And I have to say, it's not clear to me that every engineer in Facebook is capable of doing it. Part of the issue there, you are working Facebook, we see what happened with Timnit Gebru at Google. She spoke up and she was fired practically. So I think one of these issues is that what's our professional responsibility as academics. I taught a course at Rice on computing ethics and society, and the student asked at the end, okay, what's our responsibility? And they want to know what is that they can do. These are students, and they ask themselves, what is that we can do? And I think the part of the answer is I tell the students, you get to vote with your fingers, and you get to vote with your feet. So one is you should exercise your rights as a citizen and vote appropriately. But by voting with your feet, you decide whether you're going to work for that company or not. And this is something that we are very shy to tell our students. I'm very reluctant to tell, for example, our students, do not go to work for Facebook. It's an unethical company. That seemed to me a bit too strong. So we are trying to make students aware of the issues, but without telling them, don't go to work for Facebook. Some of the students, you can see that they get it, and they say, no, I will not go to work for Facebook. Many others think, it's a good job. It's a well-paying job, technically interesting. Some of my own students, one of my own students just accepted a job at Google, okay? Should I have told him, no, I mean, you're going to disappoint me deeply. Well, I'm not ready to go so far to dictate the students these choices, but I'm trying to create at least an implicit message that ultimately when you go to work does count. But this is something that we as a community need to figure out how do we deal with this industry that's more and more is becoming our version of the tobacco industry.
So on this topic of having students go to Facebook and so on, let me suggest something that possibly is naive, but I just want to try it on you. Namely,
please
take your best students, the students who are best in terms of understanding all the issues in AI ethics. They are ethically sensitive and ethically mature, and they understand the need for taking the step from AI ethics to AI policy and so on, and send them to Facebook to change Facebook from within.
So, we have to be careful as educators how direct we are going to be with our students. So we teach a course at Rice on computing ethics and society. One of the things we ask them to do at the end, there's no exam. Instead, we ask them to write an essay, and the essay is, what is my professional social responsibility? And it's interesting to then read these essays, because you find that for many of the students, the course was an eye-opener. Because there is a tendency in our community to be, I call it techno-utopianism, or if you want a bit more, techno-solutionism at the minimum, okay? There is a problem, there's every social problem has a technical solution. And this is kind of some of the mentality that you find inside industry and academia. So the students, you read the essay from the students almost, I would say, right, many students write, I was blind and now I can see. I used to think that every problem has a technical solution. Now I can see the ramification of the technology. So the hope is that these students who are now much more aware of societal and social consequences will have an impact. The impact could be by not going to work for Facebook, or by going to Facebook and pushing Facebook towards a different direction. There is a question how much you can accomplish by just being an engineer in a company. And usually the company is so big and so powerful that your ability to have an impact is fairly minimal.
I mean, you just gave an example with the Gebru tried to do that and she was fired immediately.
Yeah. So that's why I said I think there is an example of another industry which is the nuclear industry, nuclear energy industry, that eventually this industry declined, and one reason it declined is because who wants to go to study nuclear engineering? The whole field became, people say, no, nuclear is, the whole field became radioactively kind of, in both meaning, pun intended. And so the industry have kind of stagnated. And maybe the same thing will happen with the technology industry. Students will say, we don't want to go there, we don't want to work there. I mean, this is part of the question, how can we change this industry, and will it be by government regulation, or will it be by bottom-up pressure from below with students and engineers and employees and the like?
So I understand this argument about the sole engineer at the big tech company, the limit of the influence that you can hope to have. So this is probably true, but the argument strikes me as too general, because by the same reasoning, I mean, wherever I go, I'm just one individual, and I have this world around me with 7 billion, 8 billion maybe individuals. So what can little me do about the situation?
So economists call it the voting paradox. And it's exactly the same issue, that when you look at, there is election in the United States, okay, and something like 150 million vote. So you think, okay, what is going to be my impact? And you take even if I vote for better policy, when you calculate ultimately the utility for me, and you divide it by 1 over 150 million people, it's minimal. And I still have to go and spend time and maybe gas to drive there. So economically, you should not vote for this reason. But of course, if all of us follow this reasoning, then democracy fails, okay? And this is kind of a classical, if you want, tragedy of the commons, the prisoner's paradox. So the answer is that we should all suspend our economic thinking on these matters and forget that we know about these things and just do the right thing. And that's how we should be educated, that you should do right things even if it means some sacrifice to you.
But I have to add...
Being good is easy if it means there is no sacrifice. I mean, really, the only test of being good is, are you willing to do some sacrifice for being good?
Thank you. I think that's encouraging. Yes.
But I don't think that's the final answer at all. I mean, if big changes and big revolutions, the human rights or rights for women and rights for blacks and so on, they have not been won by one person doing the right thing. They have been won because there have been large social movements, and that's how you get big changes to happen. You need to build the large social movements when you want to do that.
I completely agree with you. And right now, I would say we don't quite have it. I mean, in fact, to me, it's ironical that there used to be an organization called CPSR, Computer Professional for Social Responsibility. And it started in the 80s because the Reagan administration was something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars technology. There will be a flotilla of, they'll develop some anti-missile technology that will make nuclear attack by missiles obsolete. And computer professionals argue that technology for that just did not exist and did not believe that you can build a reliable distributed system for doing this. And that's when CPSR was formed. Later on, it expanded its preview also to deal with privacy issues. But just when the internet exploded and social media started to explode, for some internal reason, CPSR collapsed. And nobody today picks up the mantle of social responsibility. I have tried to convince, for example, ACM, which I had deep involvement with, Association for Computer Machinery, that they should take the leadership of exactly this issue. And I failed to my chagrin, I failed to convince the leadership to do that. And, I can speculate. Nobody ever told me why. I mean, it was more of kind of dragging feet and not doing things rather than telling me, no, we're not going to do it because of X. But maybe one issue is that today it's very hard to talk about the adverse effect of information technology without addressing the role of the computing industry now. And I said the computer industry is immensely powerful. They have a lot of money. The majority of ACM members are not academics, but as they are called practitioners, and many of them work for these companies. So we talk about regulatory capture, but part of the issue is that it's not just regulator got captured here, but maybe even the professional societies got captured. And they have a hard time speaking truth to power. In this case, the power is the computing industry. So yeah, I think right now we don't even have leadership in this area, unfortunately.
Amanda, how do these societal issues and the role of the individual, how does this look from your humanistic point of view?
I think it's basically a mixture of individuals who are willing to sacrifice themselves, who can inspire collective action. I think that's how societies develop in this progressively, so to speak. So it's not either the individual or the social movements. It's always a mixture. So what I am waiting for is a global awakening among the engineers to collectively realize that, we have the power and we can make a difference. And some have to go first. So
right now it's only in fiction. There is a new novel written by Yanis Varoufakis, who used to be, Varoufakis used to be the minister of Greece finance minister of Greece during these events, and so obviously he was asked these questions. What are the alternate ways? And if you didn't want to do this, so he actually wrote a novel to make the points. And in that novel, there is this engineering awakening and this thing happening.
What's the name of the book?
I actually don't remember exactly. It's if you look at Varoufakis in the newest novel that he's written. But it's sadly only fiction.
Well,
I'm soon going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. But first, I would like to connect back to the issue about effects on the labor market of automation. And that you showed this slide with diagrams from, I think, one of the books by Kai-Fu Lee, where he classified professions on a two-dimensional scheme, where you had the social depth of the work on one axis, and on the other was creativity. And at first, so I was looking for a profession that is very dear to my heart in this diagram, namely university professor. And I couldn't find it, but then I realized that there were 2 points on this diagram which kind of can be taken to represent the work of a university professor. One is teacher, and the other is scientist. And scientist sat there down to the right in the 4th quadrant, and teacher sat in the opposite quadrant. So what does this say about the profession as university professor? Do we then end up, if you try to average or whatever you're supposed to do mathematically with these 2 points, do we end up in the 1st quadrant and we're kind of, for the time being, safe from automation, or are we sitting down in the 3rd quadrant? Or does this even suggest that the job as a university professor doesn't really make sense, because it's composed out of 2 really so different tasks that they shouldn't be carried out by the same person? How should I think about this?
I think there is a little bit of a contradiction in this university professor role, because as that classification showed, there is a social aspect, which is when you do the teaching and when you interact with students. Mm-hmm. And there's the other part, which when you do your research, you really are very antisocial there, because you're talking to a very small little group of your own peers, sometimes extremely narrow, and you don't really connect with society at all.
I know, I'm from mathematics.
I didn't want to rub it in, but there is an inbuilt contradiction in that, and so I don't know where the average part will that. Maybe that's why there was no university professor in that diagram. And I mean, I've often thought about whether I could be automated away, thinking about all of this, and it's not so far off as it might suggest, because I mean already there are these massive online courses, and already many courses are being taught in what is called the flipped model, which is students can listen to the lectures on these sites at home or wherever, and then your or my role is reduced to carrying out exercises in the classroom or discussions. So maybe we still have a role in that form, but it seems to be whittling down from the original role of what a university professor was doing. So I think it's still in flux. I don't know if, I think fortunately we may not be automated away immediately, but it's not so clear to me. I don't know what Barbara thinks about that, or Moshe.
Any comments from the rest of the panel?
Well, there is a beautiful story by Isaac Asimov called Professions. And he talked about his science fiction story. It talks about an age where when you come of age, at some point, all your childhood you just play. There's no reason to study. At some point, they hook you up to machine, and the machine just download the knowledge into your brain. And so the fact that it's really hard to educate people has been known for a long time. People always been looking for some technological panacea. But I think many of these attempts are, in my opinion, are naive, and they don't fully understand what education is. For example, the social dimension of education. So, for example, when it comes to MOOCs was supposedly massive open online courses. Turns out the success rate is below 10%. Only less than 10% of the students complete it. So MOOCs as a movement has been, I would say, the idea in the MOOCs and I was worried. My worry was that MOOCs will convince governments to cut investment in higher education. And that didn't happen. On the other hand, when instead of technology looking for a solution, looking for a problem, we have a problem looking for a solution, then it's very different. So a real problem we have is not with bachelor education, but with master education. So today the idea is that you go to study just 4 years, and then you'll know enough technical knowledge for the next 40 years. It's clearly a bit naive, and people need to study what we call lifelong studying. But now you are already having a job, and then you have a family. So the idea you can go and spend 3 or 4 years on a campus, or 2 years even, not realistic. So Georgia Tech started what's called the Open Masters, OMSCS, Open Masters in Computer Science. And it's an online program, but it's not a MOOC. It's online education, but it is targeting and addressing the access to instruction issue. It's not free, and it's not massive. And that actually has been rather successful. But it does involve, in fact, when people very often do not count, when they look at MOOCs, is the investment that needed to run a MOOC. So I've asked actually some of my colleagues involved in MOOCs, I said, beyond the production, what's your weekly, when you run a MOOC, what's your weekly investment? And it turns out it's more than I invest when I teach a course. Because they're all the discussion forum, and he sits every night to watch questions on the forum and to answer the questions. So very often these MOOCs, people don't take into account the invisible cost of faculty time. So again, we have to set a lot of hype, tremendous hype in this area about technology, and I think our jobs are safe, at least for the next of our career.
Maybe it depends on how old we are.
Yep, absolutely.
So shall we invite the audience? Do you have questions for this very distinguished panel?
Hi, my name is Nir Peterman. So several of you have mentioned other academic professions, right? So the science of tobacco, nuclear industry, chemistry, biology. Do any of these fields suffer from the same issue with ethics, and can we learn anything from them?
So many of these fields discovered the ethical dimension way, way, way before us. For the chemists, it goes back to World War I and chemical weapons. The physicists, World War II and nuclear weapons. And they have responded. For example, you have the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and you have Union of Concerned Scientists. And the biologists, when they just start thinking about genetic engineering, way before CRISPR came up, already in 1975, there was the so-called Asilomar Declaration. And so, yes, other discipline, and that was absolutely right. I mean, some organizations were created and people have taken actions. And I think that we somehow thought that we are just dealing with bits, what can go wrong. We completely fail to see how technology will impact society. And if you look at the two impact, I would say big impact so far that you see is, one is that of automation, and the other one of surveillance capitalism. And both of them go to societal polarization, which really break democracy, because democracy requires that we all have a sense that even with disagreement, we are working together to resolve that. We have to agree to disagree. And when you lose this agreement to disagree, democracy breaks down. And we did not see it coming. And now it's very clear, it's here, and now the question is, okay, what are we going to do about it? And yes, we can learn from some other discipline, both what was successful and what's not successful. But it takes leadership that unfortunately right now, in my opinion, is lacking.
By the way, another common thing to all these examples that we took before, the climate things, the nuclear, the tobacco, all of this was, the common thing is they all had their version of ethics washing. So there is this book called The Merchants of Doubt, which shows that all of them, they had systematic efforts to misinform, to say that they were doing ethical things and so on, and they all had exactly the same story in the background. For example, the current Facebook hearings from the whistleblower showed that the Facebook executives knew exactly what they were doing. They were fully aware. In the same way, Exxon was fully aware of what they were doing with their oil exploration and climate change. Their own scientists were the best experts in the effect on climate. Internally, they knew it better than anybody else. So you have exactly the common, this exact commonality in all these situations. So it raises the question, so what's the common solution way to address them? What is the common thing behind all of these?
I think at least in the climate and tobacco example, you can, in the rear mirror, you can see very coordinated campaigns to cause doubt among the general public about the risks. And I think a very interesting question here is whether maybe something similar is happening today in the AI sphere.
Well, it's certainly happening when people talk about over-regulating and destroying innovation. This is the same story.
Okay. Do we have more questions from the audience?
Hi, my name is Frida Bergman, and this is an open question. You're free to answer that. The ambition is to create a friendly IA in the future, and to do that, a group of scientists wrote an open letter, and Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, among many scientists and people signed that. What do you think about the open letter?
Well, so I don't know which open letter you
They call that open letter because there are, I don't remember now if it was 12 points or 18 points about how we are going to create friendly AI and to be friendly
So there are two different letters here. One was specifically about lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I think the one you're referring to is the one which addresses AI more broadly and suggests principles for...
Yes.
Okay, so would anyone like to comment on the pros and cons of this particular open letter? Did you sign it?
No, nobody has signed it, obviously. Anyway, since nobody's going, maybe I can go and say that.
I can make a comment on the lethal autonomous weapon system, because a few years ago I edited a kind of an online debate between 2 points of views. One was that automating warfare is the way to make it ethical, because we can program the ethics into the weapons. And the other one is that automating weapons should absolutely be abolished. I'm simplifying a little bit the 2 points of view. And actually, I have to say, I found that both of them are somewhat naive and they lack nuance. And you must bring nuance into the picture. Okay? So the idea that you can automate ethics, I think I'm just very, very dubious that we can have such clear rules, to dealing with the enormous complexity of situational complexity. They bring in, just look, even now we're talking about the trolley experiments and automated vehicles, and it's to me it's a sterile debate. It doesn't take you anywhere. On the other hand, to say that autonomous weapon should absolutely be abolished doesn't take into consideration that even defining autonomous is very difficult. So, for example, today you have technology where a person does push the button, but then the weapon has a target, and the weapon seeks the target. That already exists. This is precise munitions. And the question is what is the boundary, I mean, clearly we want somewhere involvement of human involvement in the loop. But how much time do we allow between the decision and the weapons? Unless we abolish warfare, we are going to see technology and we are going to see weapons becoming more sophisticated. So the simplicity that should be no autonomous weapon, to me, does not really address again the complexity of the modern battlefield.
But Moshe, I understood your talk as maybe the main message there was that we should turn ethical principles into legal principles, into laws, actually. And now you say that we cannot automate ethics, but isn't turning ethics into laws a kind of formalization and automation of ethics?
Actually, when you look at the law, you see that almost always the law is really a set of principles. And there's tremendous leeway for the justice system and discretion for prosecutor and the involvement of with the adversarial system. If it was cut and dry, we would not need judges, okay? And we have the two sides and they argue their position. And if you look at this, I mean, go and all the way to read decision by the Supreme Court, and you will see how unalgorithmic it is. There is tremendous amount of leeway because we ultimately understand that the variety of human situation is so great that we basically need human judgment to deal with it. And I think the thought of trying to automate it away is naive. That's a whole other issue. That's what I was trying to point out. And so I don't think of the law as algorithmic. It's established some rules, but there is tremendous flexibility, and you need humans in the loop who basically decide how to enforce the rules.
Point taken. Yes,
I just wanted to say, it might be difficult to do, but you said, as you said in your talk again, you should do it not because it's easy, but because it's difficult. And an example that I think we should all agree is something we should not have and prohibit or disallow, whatever. I mean, just to give a very concrete example, is what the Obama government did when they initiated their drone assassination programs. They were using specifications, again, given to some kind of automated system to collect, to fire these weapons from autonomous systems, from drones, on the basis of metadata they collected from the person's watch or from the person's. This was implemented as a policy by the Obama administration. This is clearly something which is a complete violation not only of all democratic principles, but even even the most humane principles you could think about. And something like that we should definitely ban, no matter whether how difficult it is to do encode as a law.
So we clearly need to sit down and think very hard about technology and warfare and establish international agreement in that area. I just don't think it will be amenable to very simplistic solutions. I mean, there is just too much complexity. I mean, again, if you look at today's modern battlefield, and I've been there, so I know a little bit about what I'm talking. The complexity is such, it's very even hard to say, okay, what the military call the kill chain, which is all the way from the decision to eventually somebody is shot at. It is so enormously complicated. It's just very hard even to say who is responsible. I read some years ago, there was an accident, a Belgian ferry sank in between Belgium and UK. So, and it happened because the door that keeps the door open and water flowed in and the ferry sank and hundreds of people drowned. And there was an analysis what happened there. And the answer was that you find it was lots of small faults that accumulated into one big fault. So accident, the ferry drowned, hundreds of people lost their life, but you couldn't find any one person responsible for this. It was a chain of many, many different mistaken arguments. So it's very hard to separate it and to establish, very clean causality.
Okay. Let's not go further on this particular tangent. We have, Gerardo has a question.
Yeah, Gerardo Schneider again. So I have a question for you, Moshe, in fact, given your background. Of course, as you mentioned, and have mentioned many times here, it's easier to formalize the law than to formalize ethics. But if we try not to be that ambitious and we only focus on some particular aspect of AI, in particular what happened inside neural networks and all this lack of transparency and explainability. So do you think that formal methods can do something there, or I mean, by formal methods for the audiences, the use of mathematical and logic techniques to formalize and reason about systems, that is one of the specialities of Moshe. So you think that is there something that we in the community can contribute there, or do you think that is not going in that direction?
No, I think that there is a whole area now of what we call explainable AI, and again, it's a buzzword, and right now it's a term of aspiration. There's really no explainable AI, but people are trying to develop technology for explainable AI, and it's become clear that part of it will be to try to combine what we call neural reasoning with symbolic reasoning. So this is now one of the hot topics in machine learning. It will call neurosymbolic reasoning, and it's when you look at a decision and you want some logic to explain the decision. So this is where we need logic, which is formal methods. Neural nets just give you you classify something. This is a dog with probability 0.9. But when you say, okay, how do you decide that this is a dog or a cat? That's where we need some explanation. So yes, this is now a hot research area, trying to take these two modes of reasoning. Some people call it fast and slow thinking. So fast thinking is the task that Andrew Eng mentioned. I think somebody quoted Andrew Eng. Was you Dev that? Yeah. So you think that you can decide in 1 second, and this is what we call fast thinking, and things that require planning. We plan. If you see something yellow moving in the savannah, then you need to recognize quickly that this is a lion. If you want to plan to hunt a lion, it requires some planning. This is slow thinking. And how to combine the two today is one of the major research area in AI.
Barbara, would you like to say anything about progress in...
Explain.
Okay, we'll come back to this. But anything about progress in explainability and formal methods in natural language processing?
Yeah, I can add just very briefly that in fact it is a very hot area also in, of course, also in language generation, but there is not so much yet connection to really like, formal methods as such. At the moment, there's really just a lot about looking at kind of features engineering in a way side or inside the models in a way. It's not really formalized in some way. It's very interesting to think in this line, but how to do it? Yeah, that's a good question. So
can I just add one line saying that, and the AAAI just awarded a prize yesterday to Cynthia Rudin for explainable AI, and she will give a seminar at Chalmers on December 8th. So those of you who are interested, please come to the seminar about explainable AI from Rudin, who just won the prize yesterday.
The Squirrel Award.
All right, next question from the audience.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's been a very interesting afternoon here. My name is Jenny Eriksson Lundström. I'm part of Amanda's team in this BioMe project. And more than that, I think it might be of relevance to also mention that I started my research career modeling AI for legal domains. So most people would probably say that's not even possible. But now the discussion has shifted into if it should be done. So I think that I would like to know, we've been talking about the hard questions and also the individual technologies out there, how we can actually make progress in terms of different things. But I also think we've had this very interesting question here from the audience earlier. What can I do as a designer, developer, engineer? What are the low-hanging fruits in waiting for this revolution to come, or for the masses to sort of start to change and question politics, policies, laws, etc.? So what are the low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, that's a challenge to the panel. Where can we make immediate progress?
Who's going to take that?
So there was a proposal which was somewhat controversial. I think the NeuroIPS tried to implement it, which that every paper should have a section discussing, kind of what can go wrong. I think, I think you can do it for some technologies, for some kind of research topic. I don't think necessarily you can do it for all research topic. Much of the technology that we are developing, or even the science that will be used to develop technology, is going to be dual use. You can imagine how to do good with it. You can imagine how to do bad with it, which I think makes it very, very difficult. I think the main thing we need to do is to educate better our students, all of them, all the way from undergraduate and master and doctoral student, about it's not even so much about ethics as about technology has consequences. And you guys, especially, the people who are going to go out now, the people that we're educating are somewhere between 20 and 30, and they will spend the next 40 to 50 years in the industry. And we need to educate them well. I mean, some of them will go to start companies, some of them will be executives, some of them will be top engineers. I think the main thing we should do is what we do is actually not necessarily as researchers. I think there might be some example where you can look at your research and you say, oh, this can really go wrong, I shouldn't do it. But most of what we can do is actually, if you look at the professor job, we're educators. I think that's where we can have most impact as educators.
Yeah, if I just want to supplement that, I completely agree that just putting these things at the end of the paper, your ethical consequences, we actually also do that at Chalmers, is not very effective. That's my a personal opinion, and people often treat that in a formalistic way to write something there to get things done. And I agree that the real solution is to do the education, but the thing that strikes me is that in our courses, when we teach, let's say, any technical subject, computer science or so on, we teach it in a very, from a very technical point of view. So the question of what are the consequences, I mean, it never arises in the class. You never discuss that. So maybe there should be some way of bringing in that discussion, and that's the way that this will have a longer impact. But Amanda is now...
Sorry, I interrupt you, but I was sitting here thinking that perhaps a year in sociology, political science, media and communication studies, aesthetics, philosophy, before engineering. If you want to learn about power structures, if you want to learn about how to analyze societal values, as Moshe was talking about earlier, or how to identify what is at stake, maybe the two cultures must be bridged in a radical way for future generations. And I think, because reinventing all of this is not a good idea. It will take too much time. Instead, look to those disciplines that already know enough about that and about being human in society.
I agree, but why did you say that one has to come before the other and not maybe...
Well, I was just thinking, or mix them throughout the education, but right now it seems like this reproduction of the divide occurs all the time. You have STEM dominance, and then you have the rest.
Amanda,
yeah.
Amanda, I'm in violent agreement with you on this issue. And I can tell you about a debate that right now takes place at Rice University. So the American undergraduate major is 4 years, unlike the European major, which is usually 3 years.
Uh-huh.
And the main purpose for having this fourth year is to exactly give breadth. It's called general education, that everybody maybe should take. Typically, we think that to get a bachelor degree, you need 120 hours, and at least one-fourth of it should go to general education. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, what happened is that some engineering and scientific discipline wants to encroach and use this. They say, oh no, physicists need more than this. We need, we can't. Basically, it really means a whole year, even though we do it usually concurrently. But if you look at the credit hours, it means that out of the 4 years, 1 year is dedicated to exactly these kind of studies.
Okay.
But of course, what happened now is that the physicist and the chemical engineer wants to use these credit hours. They argue, no, you cannot be a physicist unless you have taken more, and you need to know more. There's always more about physics to know, and more about engineering to know. So we now have a debate inside the faculty, and whether it's okay to say, no, 25% of the undergraduate major will be exactly looking at especially for scientists and engineers, learning more about humanities and social science, and getting a broader perspective that you will not get by just taking engineering courses. And this is right now as we speak, this is a furious debate, because you have the hardcore scientists and engineers say, no, more hours in physics, more hours in chemistry.
We seem to have, yes.
Maybe I can just add to this. I think this is a very important debate here. We have kind of the opposite in Denmark at the moment in our educations, that we, at least in the, we put up a data science bachelor 4 years back, and now the master's running as of now. And in every of these programs, we have essentially a course or even multiple in ethical dimensions, or on societal aspects of data science. I think some really require it. We have to give some mandatory courses. Of course, you could say this is too little, right? How much can you pack in one course? That's the worry, but not. In a way, you can also push it to like an NLP course without thinking about societal dimensions, or bringing it at least up is really, really worrisome. In my view, I think we need to push more to, not having only the hard topics without any reflection whatsoever. So integrate it into the curriculum in a core way. I would definitely advocate for that.
But also, I mean, I would go even further, that integration, not only like having a course like that, but that when you teach...
Throughout courses, right?
Or within the course. I mean, let's say we teach in computer vision how to do neural networks to do face surveillance, face image recognition. We teach that all the time. Image recognition is a standard topic.
Yeah.
But what are the social consequences of that?
Yeah.
I mean, you should discuss it right there, not in a separate course.
No, I agree. But ideally, you also have like a separate course on the more philosophical side and the topics that we as technical people cannot even teach. We cannot. That's one of the worries I have. We speak in silos often in our communities, which we are not the people who are really the experts on that. Okay, we bring in experts, but we need more of these dialogues in future to make this really fruitful and not leave out, or reinvent the wheel or the flat tire, let's say.
This session is approaching its end, but I think we have time for one more question from the audience, and I've seen Wilhelm has been waving.
A super brief comment.
Okay, give him the microphone.
Just a very brief follow-up comment. You discussed starting out the education with a more general, kind of broad set of skills and studies. I know that Norway has such a tradition to start out with 1 or 2 semesters of general philosophy and such topics. It could be some interesting data to look at, or be a natural experiment. Okay. So next question.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Jonathan Rudholm. I'm studying a master's study in public administration and digitalization. And my question is very broad and way too big for this, but how do we go about shaping the public policy for AI going forward? Like, you already touched upon this in a lot of ways, but do you have any clear opinions, personal opinions on what should be implemented?
Any brief final words on shaping public policy in this area?
Everybody's looking at you, Moshe.
Oh, but I'm looking at you, Dada. You haven't been shy up to now.
Well, it's obvious we need to bridge the two cultures. I think the two culture, it just not recognizing the complexity of how technology is changing society is growing such damage. We are right now in the United States. The degree of polarization is such that serious people are saying there are serious questions about the durability of the American democracy. Really, democracy is at stake right now. I mean, put it mildly. If Trump runs again in 2024, which is not out of the question, and if he gets elected in 2024, which is not out of the question, I would say it's the end of the American experiment in the multicultural democracy. Okay, and so really there's a lot at stake, and one of the things that we need to have is thing that we always thought, we shouldn't do that. We don't like politics. We shouldn't talk to this. I mean, we need to start serious conversation. Usually, I find that talking to politicians is not necessarily very useful, but there are other people who who are interested actually in studying. For example, when it comes to the U.S. Congress, there are the people who work for the politician, and they are very often the brains behind the politics. And can we engage with this kind of people and educate them about they need to understand the complexity of technology. So, for example, ACM is starting now a project called Tech Briefs. And the idea is to take various technologies and write a very short paper. I mean, a short, we mean it's a 2-pager that explain what is the technology and raises up what are the policy issues that are raised by this technology. For example, one of the first one to come out will be face recognition technology. Okay, explain the technology and explain what are the issues. I think this is a very, very useful project. Again, it is somewhat aimed in the even though it's done this committee is actually this committee is not purely. We have at least a couple of people from Europe. at least both in the United States and Europe, these documents, we are hoping that will be very useful to educate policy makers, but also what's called policy thinkers, people who think about policy.
So there seems to be great agreement in the panel about bridging the two cultures, but this is not a new proposal. I mean, C.P. Snow wrote about this in 1960, and I think the proposal surely goes way back further, maybe even ancient Greece, I don't know. So just what have we been doing wrong? We cannot just try and do the same thing that we've been trying for decades and decades. We need to do something different. Anything concrete on this?
I mean, first a short remark. I don't know what. So C.P. Snow wrote about the two cultures, but I think from that there has been a regression rather than convergence or increasing this meeting point between two cultures, and I don't know why. And what to do about it? I think a simple starting point is to introduce it in our courses. For example, I mean, especially in the context of AI, I think this makes a lot of sense. I mean, we teach face recognition, image recognition, that is a technology, but what are the social consequences? We teach automation, reinforcement learning, and automated systems. Can you give a concrete example and discuss the social consequences? Those should be in the curriculum, and I think those will have very long-lasting effects through our students learning about it and then going out into the wider world. And that's a very simple and easy starting point.
Amanda or Barbara?
Yes.
Amanda.
I'm thinking that academia has become so marketized, so this type of reaching out to people in other disciplines or across the traditions is not a fast track to a fast career, so to speak. So I think more people need to be rebellious and talk to people from Chalmers and elsewhere and in the natural sciences, and see that our task, our assignment, our mission is not to write 1,000 articles for me or my sake, but to do something good for society. So I think this is a big question about where we're at as a university structure.
Yes.
So there is a huge debate right now. What is the mission of the university?
Great.
Which Amanda, you touched on. And there are some people who say the mission of the university is just to seek the truth, to seek knowledge, and that's it. That's what we do. So and that's the model we've been operating it. If I'm a computer scientist, I should just publish paper in computer science. And especially, there is a whole now, there's a whole issue of United States of the cancel culture and where does social justice come in. And so the counter force to that to say, no, we should just focus on seeking knowledge and nothing else. My own view is that knowledge by itself, the same way I say innovation is means to an end. Knowledge must be means to an end. Otherwise, I'm okay with saying we seek knowledge, but we have always recognized that the goal is societal progress. That's why society employs us, and we are all employed by, even a private university, I'm employed ultimately by society. And they employ us because they believe that what we do will benefit society. Now, it used to be that we can say, okay, science will benefit society, let's not worry about it, let's just do the science. It's become clear that's not working anymore.
But that's also because we're not seeking the truth. The university is not seeking, that's not a mission of the university anymore. It is to provide, something to the industry or, this monoculture you talked about. This is not seeking the truth. This is something else.
Yeah. So I think we should seek the truth, and we should speak truth to power, but we should always do it. Even the truth by itself is means and not an end. Okay, and the end is the good life, not just on an individual basis, but on a societal basis. Okay, societal progress. And it means that very often we've met the enemy, and it is us. Because take, for example, the standards for promotion and tenure. Who sets them up? Well, we set them up. And we are the one who says, well, if you've written 100 articles and your colleagues have only written 99 articles, then the person who wrote 100 articles will be promoted first.
imagine that we partly put in promotion and tenure, especially in the United States, we have this tenure process. Imagine that even just to get tenure, one of the criteria will be, what have you done for society? It's a very radical thought. And I said, what do you mean by what you've done for society? Of course, the risk is immediately gets into formulae, okay? I volunteer on the weekend in soup kitchen. Okay. But how did you, as a scientist, did something for the benefit of society? Not just to say, oh, I created knowledge is good for society. But I think we need to go back to the drawing board. I think the incentive system pushes us to just publishing more and more papers in our narrow field. And as long as the incentive system is such, we can be more about the two cultures, and nothing will change, because people just follow the incentive we give them. That's how they're going to behave.
I mean, you're pointing here to a huge problem for academia. There's no possibility that we can solve this here and now, and we will have to continue the discussion elsewhere.
Start to recognize it, though.
Yeah, yes. But we're running over time, and sadly, we need to conclude. I think this has been a very, very productive discussion, and let me propose a hand for the four speakers and panelists. Thank you very much.